It began under the merciless sun, a vast, shimmering wasteland where the horizon danced with heat and death alike. The sand burned by day and froze by night, and between its dunes and rocky ridges stood a lonely fortress, a battered port clinging to survival on the edge of the Libyan coast. Its name was Tobruk, a place that would become legend. In the spring of 1941, this small port city became the eye of a storm that would rage across the North African desert for months. Here soldiers fought not for glory, but for endurance. They lived in dust, in bunkers carved into stone, under skies forever filled with smoke and the drone of bombers. Surrounded by Axis forces cut off from relief, they held their ground against the full fury of the Afrika Korps. This is the story of the Siege of Tobruk, a desert fortress under siege, a symbol of defiance carved into the sands of war. The story began with Italy's invasion of North Africa in 1940. Mussolini's dream of empire quickly became a disaster. The Italian army, stretched thin and poorly equipped, was driven back across the desert by British and Commonwealth forces in a stunning counteroffensive known as Operation Compass. Within months, tens of thousands of Italian troops were captured, and the British advanced hundreds of miles, seizing port after port, until they reached Tobruk, a small harbour that would soon become the key to everything. When the British took it in January 1941, it seemed a minor victory, another checkpoint on the march across Libya. But then the Germans arrived. In February, Adolf Hitler dispatched the newly formed Afrika Korps under a little-known general named Erwin Rommel. Within weeks, the desert would erupt in fire again. Rommel was no ordinary commander. Daring, unpredictable, and fast, he earned the nickname the Desert Fox. He struck with precision and speed, using his panzers like blades cutting through sand. In March 1941, Rommel launched his first offensive, driving the British back in a series of lightning attacks that stunned even his allies. Within a matter of weeks, the British army had fallen back hundreds of miles, all except one place, Tobruk. The port's defences, built by the Italians years earlier, formed a ring of fortifications and trenches that stretched for miles. It was the only deep-water harbour between Benghazi and the Egyptian border, and its defenders, mostly Australian troops, along with British and Indian units, refused to surrender. Rommel expected Tobruk to fall quickly. Instead, it became a fortress of resistance. By April, the city was surrounded. Inside were around 35,000 Allied troops under Major General Leslie Morshead, a tough, unyielding Australian commander. His men called themselves the Rats of Tobruk, a nickname meant as an insult by Nazi propagandists, but one they embraced with pride. They lived like ghosts beneath the sand, carving shelters into the earth to escape the constant bombardment. By day they hid from the sun and the Stukas, the German dive bombers that screamed down like demons. By night they raided enemy lines, striking quickly before disappearing back into the desert. Supplies came only by sea, small convoys braving mines, aircraft and submarines to bring food, ammunition, and hope. The defenders learned to live on little, to fight dirty, and to endure. The siege dragged on for months. The Axis forces encircled Tobruk, bombarding it relentlessly. Rommel's artillery and air power turned the port into a wasteland of wreckage and craters. The defenders answered with stubborn defiance. Every attack was met with fierce resistance. When German tanks broke through the wire, they found themselves trapped in minefields and ambushed by anti-tank guns hidden in the rocks. The Australians fought with bayonets, grenades, and raw determination. They had no illusions, there was nowhere to retreat, and no one coming soon to save them, but they held for Rommel. Tobruk became an obsession, a thorn in his side that refused to die. As the months passed, both sides suffered. The desert devoured men and machines alike. Heatstroke, disease, and exhaustion took their toll. Water was rationed to a single cup a day. Flies swarmed over every scrap of food. The dead could not always be buried. They were often left where they fell, claimed by the sand. And yet the morale inside Tobruk remained unbroken. Allied radio broadcasts told the world about the rats, the men who defied the desert fox. They became heroes, symbols of resistance in a world where hope was scarce. Relief attempts came and failed. Operation Brevity in May, Operation Battleaxe in June, both ended in disaster. With heavy losses, Rommel tightened his grip, determined to crush the fortress once and for all. But Tobruk refused to yield. Even as supplies dwindled, the defenders continued to fight, repairing defenses, tending to the wounded, and enduring endless bombardment. By the end of summer, Rommel realized that a quick victory was impossible. The siege had become a stalemate, one that drained his strength as much as it tested theirs. For 8 long months, Tobruk stood alone, isolated, battered, but unbeaten. Finally, in November 1941, the tide began to turn. The British launched Operation Crusader, a massive counteroffensive aimed at relieving the siege. After weeks of brutal fighting across the open desert, the Afrika Korps was forced to retreat. On December 10th, the blockade around Tobruk was broken. The defenders, gaunt and sunburned but still standing, walked out of their trenches to meet their rescuers. The fortress had held for 242 days, longer than anyone believed possible. Tobruk's survival became a rallying cry for the Allies. It proved that Rommel could be stopped, that courage and endurance could outlast brilliance and speed. The rats of Tobruk became legends, their defiance immortalized in history and song. Yet the story was not over. In 1942, the fortress would fall to Rommel at last, only to be retaken again later that same year. But it was the first siege that defined Tobruk, the one that turned a dusty port into a symbol of resistance, and its defenders into immortal figures of courage under fire. The siege of Tobruk was more than a battle. It was a test of will, man against environment, endurance against despair. It was the story of soldiers who dug into the earth and refused to move, of a desert fortress that became the heartbeat of defiance in one of the harshest landscapes on earth. Today, the ruins of Tobruk still stand, silent under the Libyan sun. The bunkers and trenches remain, their walls scarred but unbroken, like the men who once held them. The wind still blows across the graves of those who never left, carrying with it the memory of their stand, against Rommel, against the desert, against impossible odds. Tonight we return to that desert of dust and fire, to the roar of engines echoing through the dunes, to the courage carved into sand and stone. This is the entire history of the siege of Tobruk, the desert fortress under siege, the stand that defied the desert fox, and the endurance that became legend. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you winding down beneath the quiet of your own night, or somewhere far away, listening as the desert wind whispers its history to you? Wherever you are, take a breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. The desert stretches in every direction, a sea without water, endless and unbroken beneath a pale horizon. The wind moves softly across the dunes, carrying whispers of dust that seem as old as time itself. Nothing stirs except the slow shimmer of heat, rising like breath from the earth. To the west lies the Mediterranean, a distant gleam of blue that promises life but offers little comfort. Between the sea and the sand stands Tobruk, a name not yet heavy with memory, a place waiting to be written into history. Its harbour rests in a shallow crescent, built long ago by the Italians, who once claimed this land, their concrete bunkers now weathered and half swallowed by the sand. Around it the desert sleeps, holding its silence like a secret. For centuries, traders and conquerors have passed this way, leaving behind bones, coins, and the faint trace of forgotten empires. Now it waits again, as if listening to the coming of another storm. And in that quiet waiting, the story of endurance begins to take shape. The heat of North Africa is not like any other heat. It presses down with a stillness that feels alive, turning metal to fire and stone to glass beneath the sun. The air itself becomes a shimmer, bending light and truth until they are one and the same illusion. The soldiers who arrive here in 1941, Australians, Britons, and Indians, come from places of green and rain, carrying with them the scent of faraway homes that the desert soon erases. They step onto this alien ground and find a silence that humbles them, a silence so complete that even the sound of their boots feels out of place. The Italians had fortified Tobruk as a key harbour along the North African coast, guarding the route to Egypt and the Suez Canal, the artery through which the British Empire's lifeblood flows. To hold Tobruk is to hold a gateway, and that truth gives the place its fragile importance. Yet the men see only sand, barbed wire, and the shimmer of heat, wondering why anyone would want this emptiness. Still they begin their work, unloading crates, building defenses, and waiting for orders that come in slow, dusty fragments. The air carries the taste of salt and powder, a mix that hints at something vast beyond human control. The day ends not in triumph, but in stillness that feels heavier than fear. Night in the desert falls quickly, like the drawing of a curtain. The heat escapes into the sky, leaving the world cold and wide under a wash of stars. The soldiers gather in small clusters, wrapped in blankets, listening to the strange sounds that drift through the dunes. The call of insects, the sigh of wind, the distant creak of something shifting in the darkness. Many of them are young, barely more than boys, their laughter soft and uncertain in this foreign land. They share stories of home, of gum trees, damp fields, and narrow streets, as if speaking could anchor them against the drifting sense of unreality. Above them, the constellations burn sharp and close, more brilliant than any they have known. Somewhere beyond that sky, families wait for letters that will take weeks to arrive. In these first nights, the desert feels eternal, a place where time itself moves differently. The war seems far away, a rumor carried on the wind. Yet even in the quiet, something unseen is gathering at the horizon, patient and deliberate. The port itself hums with subdued order. Engineers inspect old Italian gun emplacements, marking maps and measuring distances, while trucks rumble softly across gravel roads. The Australians move with a casual discipline, their humour steady even under the sun's glare. The Indian units, seasoned by campaigns farther east, adjust to the new landscape with silent precision. British officers pace between outposts, studying the long line of trenches that snake through the sand. The harbour smells of oil, salt, and burnt fuel, the scent of both industry and anticipation. Each morning ships bring supplies and mail, the only reminder of connection to a world beyond the dunes. In the afternoon, mirages bloom along the horizon, waterless lakes and ghostly trees that vanish when approached. The men begin to understand that in this place, even sight cannot be trusted. The world feels suspended, as though holding its breath, and somewhere beneath that stillness, destiny begins to stir. To the locals who have lived near Tobruk for generations, the desert is not empty but alive. Bedouin herders move silently through its vastness, their tracks erased by wind within moments. They know where water sleeps beneath rock, and where shade lingers at noon. To them, the arrival of foreign soldiers feels like another mirage, another passing shadow in a land that forgets quickly. Yet they sense something different this time, a weight that will not soon lift. They watch from afar as barbed wire uncoils across the sand, and guns are mounted on the ridges. The sea brings more men each week, more machines, more steel, and with them the faint vibration of conflict yet to come. Even the wind seems to change its tone, carrying with it the smell of smoke that has not yet risen. The old ones say the desert remembers every step, every echo, and that it will remember this too. In the early mornings, before the heat hardens the air, the soldiers wake to a horizon that looks infinite. The sky softens into pink and gold, and for a brief moment the desert feels kind. They drink their tea in silence, faces turned toward the rising light. Each man lost in thoughts he will never speak aloud. Some think of home, others think of nothing at all, as though emptiness is the only way to endure. The sand cool beneath their boots, the world feels almost peaceful. The Italians have retreated farther west, and for now, Tobruk stands quiet and unchallenged. The men talk idly of the next move, not realizing that they are already where history has chosen them to stay. The fortress behind them looks almost delicate in the early light, its walls pale and curved like old bone. But even beauty here feels temporary, as if borrowed from the silence. And as the day warms again, the sense of waiting grows heavier. By midday, the sun rules everything. Its light flattens the landscape, turning every stone and shadow into a mirror of heat. The soldiers learn to move slowly, conserving energy, speaking little. Sweat dries before it reaches the ground, leaving salt on their lips and dust in their throats. The desert becomes a test of patience more than strength. Letters arrive, and the men read them under makeshift shelters, the handwriting trembling with distance and love. The words of wives, mothers, and sweethearts bring warmth that no sun can give. Yet behind the comfort, a quiet unease lingers, an awareness that something vast is moving beyond the horizon. Rumors drift through the ranks about German forces pushing east, about a general named Rommel, whose speed defies belief. The men listen, half in disbelief, half in recognition that the calm cannot last. Evening brings a gentler air, but not peace. The officers study maps by lantern light, tracing possible lines of defense, their shadows wavering across the paper. They speak of supply routes, tank traps, and the uncertain loyalty of time. The soldiers below lie awake, staring into the dark, their thoughts mingling with the hum of insects. A few write in journals, words meant to make sense of something too wide to understand. The desert offers no comfort, only the truth of its silence. It does not judge or forgive, it simply endures. The men begin to mirror that endurance, learning to move with the stillness rather than against it. Each day becomes a repetition of waiting, each night a rehearsal for the next dawn. The war for now is distant, but its shadow lengthens quietly, and by the time the first dust clouds appear in the west, the men of Tobruk will already have become part of something larger than they can yet imagine. So the desert holds them, wrapped in its endless quiet. The fortress stands as both refuge and mirage, a place caught between solitude and destiny. The air shivers with heat by day and with cold by night, but through it all the silence remains. This is the calm before history speaks, the stillness that makes the coming storm unforgettable. In this moment, the world feels paused, balanced between peace and the tremor of what approaches. Tobruk, once just a name on a map, now waits to become a word spoken in awe, sorrow, and endurance. And as the stars fade over the horizon, the desert exhales a long, slow breath. Something moves in the distance, faint, deliberate, inevitable. The men look west and see only mirage, but the wind already carries a new sound, the beginning of movement. And with that faint echo, the next chapter quietly begins. The desert does not announce its changes with thunder or fanfare. It shifts slowly, with movements so slight that only those who listen carefully can sense them. In early 1941, the sands of Cyrenaica begin to stir beneath the weight of new engines, faint tremors that ripple across dunes and rock, unnoticed by most. The Axis armies, once pushed west by British success, begin to regroup under a new commander. His name drifts through dispatches spoken in cautious tones, Rommel, a man whose reputation from the French campaign glows with an almost mythic edge. No one at Tobruk yet understands what his arrival will mean. The air remains still, the soldiers go about their duties, and the gulls cry above the harbour as they always have. Yet somewhere far beyond the horizon, dust is rising in slow, steady columns. The desert so long unmoved begins to wake, and with that awakening, the first true whisper of danger takes shape. The British forces holding Tobruk still believe the war's focus lies elsewhere, in Greece perhaps, or across the Mediterranean, where convoys struggle under constant threat. The men at the fortress speak of the desert almost fondly, as though it were a test they have already passed. They do not yet see the pattern forming in the distance. German armored divisions, small at first, spreading like the fingers of a hand across Libya's eastern frontier. Rommel's orders are cautious to defend, not to advance, but the desert has a way of changing men. In that wide emptiness, speed and daring become their own language, and Rommel understands this instinctively. His tanks move like shadows, swift and unpredictable, covering ground thought impassable. By the time reports begin to reach British headquarters, the rhythm of the desert has already shifted. Supply posts vanish, outlying patrols fall silent, and the horizon glows faintly with the heat of engines. The fortress garrison begins to sense that they are no longer alone in the stillness. The wind, once empty, now carries a new sound, low, distant, and persistent. Rommel is not yet the legend that history will later make of him. He is a man of calculation and quiet intensity, more patient than most generals, and yet impulsive in moments when instinct feels sharper than reason. To his troops, he is both leader and phantom, appearing suddenly at the front, disappearing just as swiftly into the desert haze. He studies the land with an artist's eye, reading its curves and shadows as others might read a map. He learns quickly that the desert rewards motion and punishes hesitation, to strike hard and then vanish. This becomes his creed. His men trust him, not out of fear, but because he seems to understand the rhythm of their survival. Even the Italians, weary and doubtful after earlier defeats, find in his confidence something revitalizing. The British, who once thought of this as a quiet post, begin to hear his name whispered as if it were a rumor of a storm. And beyond those whispers, the ground itself seems to hum with anticipation. In Tobruk, the defenders continue their routines, mending fences, repairing trucks, writing letters that smell faintly of dust and oil. The desert around them remains outwardly calm, its horizon shimmering in the afternoon heat. But reconnaissance patrols start returning with stories that seem half-formed, almost uncertain. They speak of armored columns appearing and disappearing in the distance, of German tanks painted to blend with the sand, of speed that seems unnatural. Some officers dismiss these accounts as tricks of mirage or nerves frayed by isolation. Others begin to mark their maps with quiet worry. The intelligence reports from Cairo grow longer, filled with phrases like possible thrust and enemy movement observed. In the still evenings, the soldiers speak softly about what might be coming. There is no fear yet, only the faint tightening of awareness, the feeling of breath held before a storm. By March, the air carries a different tension. The heat grows sharper, and the wind tastes faintly metallic, as if dust and iron have begun to mingle. The Axis advance has become undeniable, sweeping across Cyrenaica with unexpected speed. Outposts once thought secure send final signals before falling silent. The soldiers at Tobruk begin to see faint smudges of smoke along the horizon, too far to mean immediate danger, but close enough to stir unease. In the command dugouts, officers gather over maps that seem to shrink with every passing hour. Each inch of paper now represents less safety than before. Messages arrive in bursts of static, words half lost in interference, warning of German breakthroughs at El Agheila and Benghazi. The desert that once seemed endless now feels suddenly small, and within that shrinking space, the fortress of Tobruk begins to realize it is being quietly encircled. The men still move through their days with the calm of habit, but small changes mark the shift in mood. They clean their rifles more often, their laughter fades sooner, and their eyes linger longer on the western sky. Mail from home becomes both comfort and weight, reminding them of a world untouched by sand and silence. In the evenings they sit outside their shelters watching the sun melt into the dunes, its light turning everything to gold. The quiet remains, but it no longer feels restful, it feels watchful. Some speak of Rommel as though he were not a man but a kind of presence. The desert itself learning to move. The officers begin strengthening defenses that no one yet admits will soon be tested. Trucks bring in more barbed wire, more ammunition, more hope disguised as preparation. In the distance, the mirages no longer vanish. They seem to take form and weight, and as the stars rise again, the desert stillness deepens into suspense. Far to the west, Rommel's columns move with rhythm and grace. The desert seems to yield before them, offering paths invisible to those who do not listen to its silence. His tanks and trucks advance by moonlight, guided not by compass, but by instinct and memory of dunes. The British lines, stretched and weary, fall back toward Tobruk, leaving behind trails of dust and burnt fuel. In less than a month, Rommel achieves what most thought impossible. He reclaims Cyrenaica with a force still smaller than his enemies. The world will soon marvel at his boldness, calling him the Desert Fox. But for now his triumphs are quiet, measured in the flicker of oil fires and the hum of engines cooling under starlight. To the soldiers retreating toward Tobruk, his approach feels both unstoppable and unreal, like a mirage they cannot escape. The desert, once static, has become a living tide, and within that tide the fortress begins to feel its first tremor of isolation. By early April, the edge of the storm reaches Tobruk. Dust storms roll in with an unnatural rhythm, part weather, part omen. The defenders peer into the haze and see shadows that might be tanks, or might only be tricks of light. Radio messages grow more urgent. The enemy is close, advancing from the west in waves of motion that seem endless. The calm that once defined the fortress now feels like the last breath before impact. The men tighten their belts, check their weapons, and wait for orders that will bind them to this place for months to come. Rommel, somewhere beyond the dunes, watches the harbour town through binoculars, already calculating its capture. The wind blows east, carrying the faint scent of oil and dust, the language of machines preparing for battle. The desert has awakened fully now, its silence filled with motion, and as the first echo of artillery rolls faintly through the night, the fortress of Tobruk realizes that its long vigil has truly begun. When the desert winds quiet and the morning light returns, Tobruk begins to show its true shape, not as a port or a ruin, but as a fortress made from the earth itself. The Italians had built it years before the war turned this corner of Libya into a prize worth bleeding for. They had carved bunkers into the limestone hills, poured concrete along the ridges, and ringed the city with trenches that curve like ancient scars. The British and Australian engineers now inherit these remains, studying the broken geometry of defense lines and the rusted machinery left behind. Nothing is wasted here. Every wall becomes shelter, every hollow becomes a strong point. The men dig deeper, their shovels biting into dust that tastes of salt and stone. They strengthen what they can and bury what cannot be repaired, shaping the landscape into something stubborn and enduring. In the dry air, the sound of picks and hammers carries far, echoing softly across the dunes like the beating of a quiet, steady heart. By day the fortress looks unfinished, half ruined and half born, but as the sun sinks, it glows with a strange, defiant calm, as if the desert itself approves of what is being built upon it. Around the outer perimeter, coils of barbed wire stretch for miles, glittering faintly in the heat. The engineers lay mines carefully, marking the ground with silent warnings known only to them. Concrete gun pits rise in uneven rows, each one a rough promise of resistance. The men work without complaint, driven by the belief that effort itself is protection. They fashion shelters out of oil drums, old steel sheets, and broken crates, anything that might stand between them and the coming storm. The Australian units joke that the place will outlast them all, though the humour hides an uneasy pride. Dust clings to their clothes, fills their boots, and settles in their food, until it becomes part of who they are. In the evenings, when the light softens, the fortress seems almost peaceful again, a quiet circle against the wilderness. The men look out across the empty sands and feel the faint pulse of something larger than themselves. Beneath the fatigue, a sense of belonging begins to form, not to a place but to an idea of holding fast. Inside the defences, the labyrinth of trenches deepens each day. The soldiers move through them like miners of resolve, their bodies bent to the rhythm of endurance. Communication tunnels link posts together, their walls etched with names and jokes that will soon fade beneath the dust. Dugouts become sleeping quarters, stocked with water tins and ration boxes. The air underground is close and dry, filled with the scent of oil and canvas. Above ground, watch posts rise like quiet sentinels, scanning the western horizon. Every new construction feels both temporary and eternal, built from materials meant to crumble, but shaped by will meant to last. The desert wind sometimes fills these hollows with sand overnight, erasing a day's labor in silence. Still the men dig again each morning, as though the act itself were a form of prayer. To them Tobruk is becoming less a fortress of stone, and more a fortress of patience. And in that patience the foundation of their defiance slowly hardens. The harbour lies at the heart of this growing circle of resistance. Its waters, calm and blue in daylight, conceal the lifeline that keeps Tobruk breathing. Supply ships come and go under constant threat, their movements measured in darkness and secrecy. Cranes creak softly as they lift ammunition and food, the sound mingling with the murmurs of men at work. The sea brings not just supplies but a rhythm, the promise of connection to a world that still exists beyond the dust. On the docks, mechanics mend trucks under moonlight, their tools clicking like insects in the night air. The harbour smells of salt and oil, of survival crafted by human hands. Even in its vulnerability, it feels alive. Around it, the defenders weave a web of vigilance, knowing that without these waters, the fortress would wither. And in that knowledge, they begin to understand that endurance is not silence. It is movement made without panic, strength without noise. The men who labour here come from distant worlds. The Australians bring a dry humour that turns hardship into routine. The British officers carry the weight of discipline shaped by years of empire. The Indian soldiers, calm and precise, move through the heat with the grace of men long accustomed to endurance. Together they create a rhythm of survival that feels both mechanical and deeply human. They learn each other's languages in fragments, enough to share water, cigarettes, and quiet conversation beneath the stars. When they rest, they speak of home, their words carried softly away by the wind. In those exchanges, something invisible begins to bind them, something stronger than nationality or rank. The desert teaches them equality, stripping away every comfort until only character remains. Their laughter, when it comes, feels like resistance itself, a sound that the desert cannot swallow. And as the days pass, the fortress grows not only in walls but in spirit, becoming a living circle of human endurance. By April, the defensive ring around Tobruk has taken on its final shape. There are 20 miles of trenches, 12 miles of wire, and countless hidden emplacements that watch every approach. From the air, it might look like a rough scar drawn across the pale earth, but from within, it feels like a heartbeat surrounded by silence. The men know that Rommel's forces are close now, that the outer world is slipping away. Still, they work on tightening bolts, measuring fields of fire, and memorizing the ground as if studying an ancient text. The engineers mark their maps, not with fear, but with quiet certainty. They do not imagine glory, they imagine holding, and that thought alone gives them peace. The fortress, once an Italian relic, now feels reborn through sweat and intention. Even the crumbling walls seem to stand straighter, as though proud of what they are becoming. And beyond the wire, the desert glows in late afternoon light, serene, deceptive, waiting. Every fortress is also a mirror of those who defend it. In Tobruk, that mirror reflects not grandeur, but endurance made from dust and exhaustion. The men have no illusions of swift relief or easy victory. They prepare for a long waiting, a kind of still war that will test everything but sound, almost like silence. They adapt their senses to the desert, learning to read shadows, to smell the air for fuel, to listen for distant engines long before sight confirms them. The fortress becomes part of their bodies, and they in turn become part of it. Food arrives sporadically, water is precious, rest is never deep. Yet beneath these hardships grows a sense of belonging to something that cannot easily be named, a shared defiance that transcends reason. The men call it holding on, but it feels more sacred than that, something between duty and quiet love. And as they move through their days, they begin to believe that even stone can learn endurance from the human heart. In the last days before the first assault, Tobruk breathes with quiet anticipation. The men move more slowly now, conserving strength, speaking less. The wind rises at night, carrying the faint smell of oil and dust from the west. Sometimes they think they hear engines in the distance, but the desert has its own voice and often deceives. Orders come to hold positions, to wait, to let the enemy come. The stars shine hard and cold, indifferent witnesses to all human resolve. Within the trenches, candles burn low, their light flickering across walls carved with names. the fortress stands complete, not in perfection but in readiness. Every man within its circle understands, in his own way, that there will be no retreat, and as dawn approaches, a pale light, spreading across the ridges of dust and stone, the stillness deepens once more, the calm heartbeat before the desert begins to roar. The desert stirred under a haze of heat and rumor. Whispers of a new commander, swift and unpredictable, drifted through the ranks like dust on the wind. His name was Rommel, a soldier whose instincts seemed to move faster than logic, whose calm eyes could read the battlefield as if it were a map drawn by fate. To the defenders in Tobruk, he was still just a name carried by frightened scouts and intercepted signals. Yet something in the desert had shifted, a new rhythm, sharper and more daring, echoing through the dunes. The Germans came not as a slow march, but as a blur of engines sweeping over sand like wind made metal. Each day new reports arrived, armored columns vanishing into mirage, reappearing where no one thought they could be. The defenders felt the pressure before they even saw the enemy. The horizon began to move, and in that shimmering distance, the ghost of Rommel began to take form. When the assault came, it came without ceremony. Tanks moved like shadows, their outlines bending in the morning heat, appearing where there had only been sand a moment before. The first shells fell with a hollow sound, thudding into dry earth, shaking the fortress awake. The defenders scrambled into their dugouts, their hearts steady but uncertain, each man realizing the siege had begun in earnest. Rommel's attack was not just power, it was deception made real, striking from angles no one expected. His strategy was to confuse, to make the defenders doubt what they saw. And for a time it worked. Lines broke and reformed, outposts lost touch with one another, and dust blotted out the sun. Yet amid the chaos, something remarkable held, the will of the men who refused to move. The desert roared, but Tobruk did not yield. Rommel's genius was not in brute force, but in rhythm. He made war seem alive, constantly shifting, never still, always breathing. His armored divisions danced across the desert floor, finding paths where none existed, turning geography itself into a weapon. The defenders soon understood they were facing not just a soldier, but a mind tuned to the pulse of the land. Yet even as the enemy seemed everywhere, they found strength in knowing where they stood, behind stone, wire, and the will to endure. Engineers repaired, gunners adjusted, and medics moved through the trenches with quiet precision. Each act of defiance became a thread in the fabric of the siege. The attackers might move fast, but the fortress endured by being still. In that stillness, Tobruk began to learn the rhythm of Rommel's song, and how to survive it. Reports came in of armored thrusts, cutting deep into the desert, only to vanish when the defenders refused to break. Rommel's tanks swept around the fortress, searching for weakness, probing at night, attacking at dawn. Yet Tobruk's circle of steel remained unbroken, its defenders adapting with every strike. The Australian and British troops began to study his habits, how he favored speed over supply, surprise over safety. They learned to use his own daring against him, baiting him into attacks that faded into the dust. Rommel's brilliance, though dazzling, was not invincible. The longer the siege went on, the more his momentum met resistance, not from stronger weapons but from quieter resolve. The desert itself seemed to resist his speed, swallowing his footprints in silence. And so, amid the roar of engines, the defenders began to sense a balance returning. In the heat of April and May, the siege became a test of patience. The air shimmered and the days stretched long, but neither side could claim victory. Rommel's forces, short of fuel and ammunition, circled like wolves at the edge of the firelight. Inside Tobruk, The men rationed water and patched their wounds with what they could find. Dust became part of their skin, and silence became their companion. They began to speak of Rommel as if he were a phantom. Someone felt more than seen, his presence woven into every gust of wind. Yet that ghost could not breach their circle. The fortress, though battered, stood proud against illusion. And in that endurance, the myth of Tobruk began to rise alongside the legend of Rommel. The men at the front began to speak of time differently. Each dawn was a reprieve, each dusk a quiet triumph. They no longer thought of days, but of survival, the rhythm of holding, waiting, and breathing through the heat. Letters home spoke of endless sky and endless dust, of a war that felt like it existed outside the world's pulse. In the quiet hours, they could almost feel Rommel's presence beyond the wire, watching, waiting, planning. But they also knew that beyond his brilliance lay exhaustion, the slow erosion of supply and strength. The fortress had become a mirror, reflecting every ambition back upon the one who dared to break it. Rommel's ghost could move fast, but it could not pass through stone. The men of Tobruk had learned to listen to the silence and find comfort in its truth. By midsummer, the siege had settled into a strange balance between attack and endurance. Rommel's tanks would appear in the distance, their shapes wavering like heat itself, then fade once more into invisibility. Each attempt to breach the fortress ended in frustration. The defenders, though weary, began to understand that they were not merely holding ground, they were shaping history. The desert that once felt empty now carried meaning, written in trenches, bunkers, and the unspoken courage of those who would not fall back. Rommel, for all his brilliance, found himself facing something he could not outthink: the human will when anchored to place. It was not a victory, but a realization that both sides were trapped by their own legends. And in that realization, the desert grew quiet again, holding its secrets close. In the end, the first assault faded into silence, like a storm that had spent its strength. The fortress of Tobruk remained scarred but unbroken, its defenders watching the horizon with steady eyes. Rommel withdrew to regroup, his legend growing even in retreat. The men inside the fortress rested, if such a thing was possible in heat and dust, their thoughts drifting between pride and weariness. They did not yet know that this was only the beginning, that months of siege still waited beyond the dunes. But they had seen the face of the enemy and held their ground against him. The ghost of Rommel would haunt the desert for many more months, yet Tobruk had proven it could not be possessed by force alone. As the sun set over the fortress walls, the sand settled once more into stillness, and in that stillness the next chapter of endurance quietly began to take shape. The desert closed in around Tobruk, folding the city into a circle of silence and anticipation. The outer world seemed to slip away, leaving only sand, stone, and the stubborn walls that rose from them. The men walked along trenches that now felt like veins of the city, carrying water, messages, and quiet courage to every corner. Dust rose from every footstep, settling in the hollows of helmets and the folds of uniforms. The air shimmered with heat, and even the horizon appeared closer, pressing against the fortress, as if it too were curious about what might happen next. The shelling began in the distance, not constant but insistent, punctuating the day with deep, rolling echoes that faded into the stillness. Between bursts the desert whispered softly, the wind through dunes, the rattle of loose metal, the faint cries of gulls above the harbor. The men began to recognize this rhythm, the pause and strike, as a pattern to be read as much as endured. In this way they became both witnesses and participants in a living history. And as night fell, the circle of fire seemed to draw tighter, enclosing them in quiet vigilance. Within the fortress, Routines grew dense with purpose. Meals were shared in silence, water rationed carefully, and every duty carried a weight of inevitability. Letters were written with slow hands, filled with words meant more for comfort than explanation. The trenches, once lines of work, became homes of habit, each corner memorized and each post known intimately. Men spoke in soft tones about their families, about rain, about the small green places they missed, as if naming them could preserve them across the distance. The wind moved constantly, carrying the scent of dust and salt, of engines beyond the horizon, of the fires that marked distant conflict. At times the silence between bombardments was almost louder than the sound itself, a hollow filled with the anticipation of what might come. Even in this pressure, the fortress seemed to breathe with them, its walls absorbing worry and returning calm. The soldiers understood they were both trapped and safeguarded, held by the desert as much as they held it. And within that paradox, a quiet endurance began to settle in their bones. The first night under siege was different from any that had come before. The stars hung sharp above Tobruk, cold and distant, while below fires burned in scattered outposts, outlining the fortress like quiet beacons. Shadows moved along the wire and the ridges of trenches, and every soft sound seemed magnified. A clatter of metal, a shifting of sand, a distant engine humming under its own momentum. Officers whispered instructions with careful clarity, knowing that calm voices could steady men more than orders shouted in panic. Soldiers adjusted their positions repeatedly, trading stories with those nearby in the way humans do to soften silence. The harbour water reflected moonlight serene and still, its surface betraying none of the storm encircling it. The smell of dust mixed with oil and metal, an aroma that would linger in memory long after the war ended. Each small task, tightening a bolt, checking a ration, marking a distance, became a meditation. Even in vigilance, there was room for observation, for noticing how the desert changed its color and texture between bursts of action. And as the night deepened, the circle of fire seemed less threatening and more like a rhythm to follow. By day, the fortress pulsed with quiet motion. Patrols moved along the edges of wire and trench, checking fields of fire with careful eyes. Engineers repaired gaps, reinforced walls, and marked hazards with meticulous care. The men began to anticipate the enemy's timing, measuring the intervals between distant explosions with an instinct sharpened by weeks of observation. Dust curled around boots and weapons, as if the desert itself were reminding them of its presence. Messages from higher command were scarce, leaving Tobruk largely to its own devices, a city suspended in time. Each sunrise brought light to walls and rooftops, and the soft shimmer of sand stretching beyond them. In these hours the fortress became not a cage but a focus, a place where preparation and patience coalesced. Even as distant guns roared, the men found a rhythm in the repetition of duties, and with each evening that returned calm, the circle of fire settled once more into quiet familiarity. The soundscape of Tobruk became a language all its own. The whistle of the wind through gaps in wire spoke of distance and direction. Artillery echoes rolled in faint and far, each one a punctuation mark in an ongoing narrative. Engines hummed in the west, sometimes close enough to raise attention, other times fading like a secret in the desert. Footsteps, boots shifting over sand and stone, marked a constant vigilance, a quiet heartbeat of human presence. Birds moved overhead, their calls sharp against the soft sigh of wind. Even the faint drip of water in dugouts, or the creak of a door hinge, became a part of the subtle music of siege. The men learned to read these sounds, understanding the layers of threat and calm that coexisted in every moment. In listening, They trained themselves not only for survival, but for endurance, and as they lay beneath the stars at night, the world's quiet pulse joined theirs. Supplies arrived in measured streams, carried by ships that threaded through the Mediterranean with care and patience. The arrival of food, ammunition, and mail became moments of quiet celebration, a reminder of life beyond the desert circle. Yet each arrival also emphasized isolation. The fortress was dependent, fragile, and self-contained. The men handled every crate with care, as though their touch preserved not just the contents, but the fragile stability of the city itself. Trucks and carts moved silently across sand paths, their drivers learning to read the desert in ways that seemed instinctive. Water was precious, rationed carefully, and shared without fuss. Even small luxuries, a fresh loaf of bread or a tin of fruit, became infused with the meaning of survival. In these routines, the soldiers learned the paradox of captivity and agency. Tobruk became a world unto itself, holding both history and the fragile present in balance. And in that balance, the men found a quiet strength that could withstand weeks of isolation. In the evenings, as shadows lengthened across sand and stone, reflection became possible. Men wrote letters, traced maps, or spoke softly to neighbors about the distant world. The fortress felt more like a living organism than a collection of walls, responding to effort, observation, and care. Small acts, tying a rope, adjusting a wire, cleaning a rifle, became meditative, each repetition affirming endurance. Dust settled again in the trenches, soft and thick, as if the desert were returning to rest. Time became elastic, stretched by routine, measured in tasks rather than hours. The horizon remained distant, but its pressure felt constant, like a tide pushing toward them without sound. Tobruk held, not in triumph, but in patient constancy. And as night deepened, the men drifted to sleep under the stars, their breathing slow and steady, carrying the circle of fire within them. The first weeks of full siege shaped the character of Tobruk. Its men learned that chaos could be absorbed, uncertainty met with preparation, and the desert itself interpreted through quiet observation. They became both prisoners and custodians, holding the city not as a possession, but as a story in motion. The fortress had transformed, no longer simply stone, wire, or sand, but a reflection of human will against time and space. Each morning brought the same questions, the same small challenges, yet the answers were found in habit, attention, and careful thought. The winds whispered, the guns echoed faintly, the sea shimmered, all reminders of a world at once distant and immediate. The circle of fire, once threatening, became a rhythm they could inhabit without panic, and in that inhabitation they discovered a calm authority that would guide them through the trials still to come. The first weeks of siege passed with a strange rhythm, one measured more in patience than in action. The desert, once a backdrop for tension and anticipation, became a teacher of endurance. Soldiers learned to sleep under the stars, blankets spread thinly over sand that held the memory of sun and wind. Water was precious, rationed slowly, and every sip became a small meditation. Letters home arrived sporadically, each one carrying hope, worry, and the faint scent of distant lands. Writing became a quiet ritual, a way to connect with lives that existed far from the whispering dunes. The wind carried stories too, soft and patient, rustling the edges of canvas tents and the pages of journals. Even the soldiers' steps softened, moving deliberately along trenches, now familiar as the back of a hand. Humor emerged in small bright sparks, shared jokes, quiet smiles, and a camaraderie that thrived in the monotony. And in the lull between distant gunfire and the whispering wind, the men found their own kind of rhythm. The fortress itself became an extension of the men who lived within it. Each trench, dugout, and bunker reflected small acts of care and adaptation. Footpaths were smoothed, corners swept, and supplies stacked with a quiet order that contrasted the chaos outside. Tools became extensions of their hands, and even the simplest task, tightening a bolt or marking a map, carried meaning. The sand, soft underfoot, filled every crevice, covering mistakes and creating a sense of continuity. Some men took to walking along the edges of the wire at dawn, listening to the quiet whisper of wind across dunes. Others lingered near the harbor, watching gulls circle over still water, their calls bright against the endless blue. The routine of duty began to feel almost soothing, a way to measure time without panic, and in these days the desert itself seemed to breathe with them, teaching them that stillness could be its own kind of strength. Meals became quiet gatherings, small rituals of sustenance and companionship. Rations were simple, tins of food, biscuits, and the occasional sweet brought from home. Men would share slices of bread, passing morsels with a quiet ceremony that felt like gratitude. Conversation drifted from news of the distant war to tales of childhood, favorite songs, and the taste of rain on familiar soil. Laughter, low and private, punctuated the monotony of days spent guarding, digging, and observing. Even in moments of scarcity, the soldiers discovered creativity, finding new ways to flavor food or repurpose materials for comfort. The harbor reflected afternoon light on the walls of the fortress, a reminder of life beyond sand and wire. And as night fell, the men settled into sleeping routines that brought them closer to the earth. They defended. Each day became a meditation, each small action a quiet affirmation of survival. And in these rhythms, the desert taught them to move in harmony with time itself. The heat of midday was softened by the patience of adaptation. Hats shaded faces, and water-soaked cloths draped over necks, keeping sun and dust at bay. Soldiers walked slowly, aware of the energy each step consumed. In the quiet corners of the fortress, journals and letters were opened, and stories were told in soft voices. Engineers repaired and maintained what was needed, their movements deliberate and calm, almost ceremonial. The sound of tools against metal and stone became part of the larger silence, blending into the whisper of wind across the dunes. Even as distant engines hummed or artillery boomed faintly beyond sight, the men found their own calm. Shadows lengthened over sand and wire, the world slowing under the weight of the sun's arc. And in these hours, patience became more than survival. It became a quiet art, taught by the desert and learned by those who listened. Night brought a different kind of quiet, one filled with reflection and small rituals. Stars shone with sharp clarity above the fortress, and constellations became companions for those lying awake in trenches. Some spoke softly to neighbors, sharing memories or stories from home, while others wrote in journals by flickering lanterns. The scent of sand mingled with oil and canvas, a constant reminder of place and effort. Fires burned low, casting gentle warmth and soft light across worn faces and sturdy hands. The men learned to listen, to the desert wind, to distant echoes, and to the subtle movements of those around them. Even in this stillness, humor found its way in whispered jokes or playful exchanges over shared tasks. The sea beyond the harbor glimmered quietly, a reminder of connection to life outside the siege. In this balance between quiet and attention, the soldiers discovered a calm authority, and as sleep finally drew them under, the desert seemed to cradle them in its patient embrace. The monotony of days and nights became almost hypnotic, a repetition that shaped both body and mind. Tasks were repeated, small repairs made, and observations noted with unwavering attention. Each sunrise and sunset marked subtle changes in wind, light, and sand, teaching the men to see the imperceptible. Even small animals like insects or desert birds became points of interest, reminders of life persisting amid isolation. Laughter and song, faint and private, threaded through the stillness, keeping hope alive without disturbing the quiet. Water conservation and rationing became rituals as deliberate and calming as any prayer. The fortress, once simply a ring of stone and wire, became a shared meditation of effort, observation, and patience. And in this meditation, men discovered a rhythm that allowed the siege to exist, not only as threat, but as quiet continuity. Friendship and camaraderie grew like roots beneath sand and stone. Men learned to rely on one another, not through orders, but through unspoken understanding. Shared meals, shared watches, and shared quiet moments of reflection created bonds that would outlast any distance or conflict. Humor softened the weight of waiting, and simple acts of kindness became anchors in the desert's vastness. Conversations turned to books remembered from childhood, songs sung softly, or memories of rain and rivers far away. Even small competitions, racing along trenches or crafting inventive shelters, became exercises in resilience. The fortress hummed with life of a subtle kind, an energy measured not in action, but in connection. And as dawn broke again over the dunes, it carried the quiet reassurance that endurance itself could sustain a spirit. By the end of long weeks, the men understood that Tobruk was no longer simply a place, but a presence. The desert had become a teacher, and patience its curriculum. Sand and silence formed the rhythm of life, punctuated only by the occasional distant roar that reminded them of the outside world. Yet in that rhythm they discovered humor, warmth, and humanity. Letters and journals connected them to home, meals connected them to one another, and trenches connected them to the earth. They defended the fortress had become a circle of life within the vast emptiness, a place where routine transformed into meditation. The soldiers moved with quiet confidence, observing, repairing, conserving, and laughing softly. And in this slow, hypnotic flow, they learned that endurance could be as gentle and sustaining as any quiet wind. The name arrived first as a whisper, carried in the harsh tones of enemy propaganda. Rats of Tobruk, they called them, meant to belittle, to reduce the defenders to creatures scuttling in the dust. The men of the fortress heard it, and at first it stung with the bitterness of insult. Yet slowly something remarkable happened. The word was taken into their own mouths, repeated quietly among trenches and bunkers. It became a badge of endurance, a symbol of cleverness, resourcefulness, and unbroken will. Soldiers laughed softly as they accepted it, the name twisting from derision into defiance. It was no longer a mark of shame, but a quiet anthem of survival. Each time it was spoken, the fortress seemed to swell with its own spirit, the walls echoing the resilience of those inside. And in that transformation, the men realized that identity could be forged even under siege. The desert's silent witness seemed to approve of this small but enduring triumph. Life in Tobruk settled into patterns that gave shape to the notion of rats. Soldiers moved through tunnels and trenches with nimble care, avoiding the glare of the sun and the gaze of distant guns. Supplies were scuttled and shared, hidden and conserved, every movement precise and deliberate. In quiet moments, the men compared notes on the enemy's patterns, small victories and tricks learned in shadowed corners. Letters home carried stories of the fortress's ingenuity, of men who survived by wit as much as by courage. Even humor became sharper, lighter and wilder in the face of isolation. Jokes, nicknames, and small bets passed from trench to trench, linking scattered individuals into a single organism. The word rats began to feel like a presence, something more than a label. A spirit of survival that moved quietly beneath the sand and wire. Each act of endurance, each small cleverness, was proof of life persisting against odds, and slowly the name became not insult, but the quiet heartbeat of the fortress. The press far away caught wind of the defenders' resilience. Newsreels carried grainy images of men smiling, of wire-tangled streets and sand-smoothed bunkers. Headlines praised their stubbornness, framing Tobruk as a symbol of human tenacity in the vastness of the desert. Letters arriving from home carried the same reverent tone, and families whispered about the rats with pride. The men themselves began to internalize this attention, not as vanity, but as validation of effort. Each day spent repairing wire, moving supplies, or observing distant shadows became a quiet story of resistance. Even small victories, saving a ration, finding a concealed path, repairing a vehicle under sun and dust, took on a larger meaning. The desert seemed to hold its breath around these moments, as if acknowledging the fortress's significance. And the men who once moved quietly through the sand now understood themselves as part of a narrative that stretched far beyond Tobruk. The nickname shaped the culture within the fortress. New arrivals were introduced to it softly, as a tradition rather than a taunt. Every patrol, every shift in a bunker, carried the weight of history in its practice. Soldiers began to see themselves as small, clever creatures, adept at surviving in harsh terrain and against greater forces. They adapted quickly, learning to make use of every shadow, every dune, and every scrap of material. The desert became both playground and teacher, offering lessons in observation, patience, and quiet cunning. Even routines once mundane, cleaning weapons, repairing trenches, rationing water, were elevated into small rituals of competence. And in the whispers of night, when the wind swept across the sand and dust, the fortress seemed to hum with the shared understanding of identity. The rats were no longer simply soldiers. They were symbols of stubborn survival. And in that understanding, the men found a soft, steady pride that could carry them through weeks of waiting. Letters and stories from home reinforced the quiet mythos of Tobruk. Families and journalists alike described the defenders as clever, resourceful, and enduring. The soldiers read these accounts with a calm mixture of pride and disbelief, humbled that distant voices had noticed the rhythms of their quiet heroism. Inside the fortress, jokes about the name became lighter, weaving through conversations like threads in a tapestry. Even those who had once bristled at the term began to embrace it, feeling its resilience in their bones. The desert continued its slow instruction, teaching patience and endurance while the men shaped their own identities around survival. Every night, as stars shone above the dunes, they whispered the nickname among themselves, quietly reinforcing the shared culture of the fortress. And even as distant engines hummed or artillery rolled faintly across the horizon, the men moved with confidence, their sense of self anchored in the rhythms of work, observation, and quiet defiance. The enemy's attempts to dislodge them only strengthened the identity they had adopted. Skirmishes, brief and distant, tested resolve and ingenuity. Every action, from repairing wire to observing movements in the distance, was reinforced by the knowledge that they were both defending and embodying something larger than themselves. The desert, once merely an obstacle, became a partner in this quiet transformation, teaching patience, observation, and cleverness. Men learned to move through sand, wire, and stone with the efficiency of small, determined creatures, adapting to rhythm and circumstance alike. Even the soundscape, wind, distant artillery, footsteps across sand, became a guide rather than a threat. Each day added layers to the culture of the fortress, reinforcing both solidarity and identity. The nickname persisted, a talisman of resilience whispered through trenches and bunkers alike, and in its repetition, it became more than a word, a quiet declaration of endurance. Time slowed under the siege, stretching days into meditative exercises of survival. The rats moved in synchrony with the desert's rhythm, learning to read every subtle shift in light, wind, and distant sound. Supplies were handled with care, meals shared in quiet ceremony, and duties performed as rituals that strengthened the body and mind. Humor and humanity persisted, small flames against the endless expanse of sand. Stories of clever tricks, shared food, and minor victories passed through the ranks, carrying energy as much as information. Even as the world beyond Tobruk remained distant, its influence shaped the defenders' identity, reminding them of their place in history. The desert continued its teaching, enforcing patience and observation while leaving room for creativity. In every step, laugh, and whispered tale, the men discovered the rhythm of endurance. And as night settled across dunes and wire, the fortress held itself quietly, bound together by name, purpose, and spirit. By the time the nickname had fully taken root, Tobruk had become more than a city under siege. It was a symbol, a quiet monument to resourcefulness, patience, and human stubbornness. The men, once simply soldiers, had become storytellers, keepers of their own small legend. They moved through the sand with nimble care, their identity intertwined with every task, every observation, and every act of shared survival. Humor, quiet defiance, and endurance became as essential as water or food. The fortress itself seemed to pulse with this new energy, absorbing effort and returning confidence. And as dawn broke over the dunes, the rats of Tobruk understood that they were part of something enduring, a quiet testament written in dust, stone, and human will. In that realization, even the desert seemed to pause, acknowledging the presence of those who had claimed it not by force, but by patience and cunning. The night fell over Tobruk with an almost sacred stillness, a velvet quiet that made every whisper of wind feel amplified. Yet beneath that calm, Rommel's forces moved with precision, sliding silently across dunes like water shaping the desert. Tanks and armored vehicles traced hidden paths, their engines' low murmurs beneath the vast sky. Explosions began in the distance, punctuating the dark, with sharp bursts that turned sand into ephemeral waves of fire. The defenders listened, measured, and waited, knowing instinctively that every tremor carried meaning. Trained eyes scanned the horizon for shadow and silhouette, every movement interpreted as signal and story. Tobruk's walls, strengthened by weeks of patient labor, held steady against these sudden strikes. The wind carried the scent of dust and oil, mixing with faint smoke from distant blasts. Even as the desert roared, the fortress remained a place of rhythm and observation, and in that rhythm, the men found the calm to endure the night's assault. Orders were whispered along trenches and through dugouts, deliberate and clear. Soldiers moved with careful purpose, adjusting positions, checking weapons, and conserving energy. Each man understood the pattern of Rommel's attacks, the way speed and misdirection worked together, like threads in a silent loom. Trenches became arteries of coordination, moving water, ammunition, and quiet reassurance from post to post. Engineers reinforced weak points, hammering quietly into stone and sand, their work almost meditative. Above ground, the night sky seemed infinite, stars like distant watchers, offering constancy amid sudden chaos. Each distant rumble or flash was recorded, remembered and interpreted, part of a slow dance between pressure and patience. The desert, once passive, now felt alive with strategy, yet the fortress adapted, absorbing every motion without losing its quiet center. And as the first light of early dawn brushed dunes in soft color, the defenders exhaled a measured breath, waiting for what might come next. The roar of engines and the tremor of distant blasts shaped the hours like a tide. The men moved through their roles with an intimacy born of repetition, each action a carefully timed note in the larger rhythm of survival. Tanks slid across open ground, their presence momentary, vanishing into shadows almost as soon as they appeared. Observers noted every change in light and movement, the whisper of sand against treads, the echo of rolling metal across dunes. Messages were relayed silently, through gestures or coded signals, a quiet choreography of attention. Supplies were shifted to meet the demand of sudden thrusts, the fortress itself seeming to bend without breaking. Even in tension, moments of calm threaded through the night, small pauses where breath and thought could be regained. And as dawn deepened, the desert settled again, leaving behind the faint scent of smoke and the memory of controlled chaos. Tobruk endured, its walls and men intertwined in a singular, resilient pulse. Rommel's tactics tested every measure the fortress had prepared. The assaults came at multiple points, probing defenses like a cat through shadowed alleyways. The defenders, aware of the deception, responded with quiet precision, shifting men, repositioning guns, and reinforcing weak lines without haste. The desert absorbed the movement and returned nothing but the sound of wind and distant explosions. Men moved like the desert itself, patient, measured, and ever observant. Every trench, dugout, and bunker became a microcosm of vigilance, a small world where preparation was everything. Even minor actions carried significance, the tightening of a bolt, or the placement of sandbags becoming part of the story of resistance. The night carried an intensity that was almost tactile, pressing against skin and clothing with the weight of anticipation. And yet the fortress did not yield, holding firm in the teeth of Rommel's clever strikes. As the hours unfolded, the rhythm of assault and pause became hypnotic. The desert seemed to breathe alongside the men, inhaling smoke and dust, exhaling calm between bursts of action. Observers reported movements in subtle waves, armor glinting briefly, before disappearing into dune and shadow. Men learned to interpret these waves as signals, reading them like lines of a slow, deliberate script. Communications passed along trenches were quiet, precise, almost musical in their timing. Supplies were delivered with care, movements synchronized to the natural cadence of the desert night. Every small act of attention reinforced the larger structure of survival, weaving together stone, sand, and human patience. And in those hours, Tobruk revealed the quiet power of resilience, a fortress more alive than any vehicle or shell. By the time dawn crept fully across ridges, the men had survived another trial without panic, their minds as focused as the walls around them. The assaults left their trace in the form of sand scattered and dust stirred, but the fortress itself remained intact. Soldiers moved to inspect positions, quietly noting what worked and what required reinforcement. Even in exhaustion, there was a shared understanding that endurance was a kind of victory in itself. Rommel's genius for speed and misdirection was apparent, yet so was the quiet genius of preparation, patience, and observation. The men carried water, cleaned weapons, and reinforced positions, their actions deliberate and unhurried. Humor returned in small sparks, a whispered joke or a soft smile between shifts. The desert held both threat and calm, and the fortress had learned to navigate between them. And as night once more approached, The men settled into trenches with a sense of measured anticipation, ready to meet the desert's rhythm again. Each day under siege sharpened awareness, teaching observation and timing in ways books never could. The desert became a teacher of subtlety. Each grain of sand a note in a larger melody of endurance. Men began to notice patterns in the hum of distant engines, the flicker of fire on dunes, the behavior of birds and shadows alike. Even small movements in the wind could signal approach or retreat, giving the defenders precious time. Every task, repairing wire, distributing supplies, relaying messages, was performed with intention, a silent pact of survival. Tobruk, in its quiet dignity, taught the men that strength need not shout to be effective. The night carried both danger and rhythm, a lesson in patience and measured response, and as each day and night passed, the fortress continued to endure, quietly defiant against the cunning and speed of the desert fox. By the end of the night, the desert settled once more into its habitual stillness, holding the memory of engines, fire, and dust in quiet suspension. The men of Tobruk moved through the aftermath with steady steps, careful hands, and thoughtful minds. They repaired, they observed, and they rested in the intervals that felt as important as the assaults themselves. Rommel's presence lingered like a shadow, felt more than seen, reminding the defenders of the cleverness arrayed against them. Yet even that shadow could not penetrate the calm they cultivated within walls and trenches. Small conversations, shared water and soft laughter, threaded through the fortress like quiet currents. The desert, for all its vastness, seemed to recognize the enduring pulse within the circle of stone and sand, and as dawn painted the horizon with gentle color, Tobruk remained intact, its rhythm of resilience unbroken, waiting patiently for the next chapter of endurance to arrive. The desert's heat settled into the bones, slow and insistent, as if the sun had found a way to reach even the quietest thoughts. Men felt it in every step, in every breath, the warmth of sand and stone pressing into their skin. Dust drifted through the air, fine as powder, finding its way into mouths, eyes, and the corners of consciousness. Thirst became a constant companion, measured in careful sips and imagined water. Flies, persistent and unyielding, danced through the trenches, reminders of life continuing even amid hardship. Dysentery and exhaustion claimed quiet spaces, subtle and insistent, leaving men to navigate fragility with patience. Conversations were slower, voices hushed, humor tinged with fatigue. Even sleep carried the scent of sand, each breath tasting faintly of desert wind. Yet in these trials a strange intimacy formed, linking men across wire and trench, and as the sun dipped low, the desert's heat seemed to pulse in quiet solidarity with those who endured it. Hands became instruments of survival, roughened and steady. Water was measured and cherished, its scarcity shaping every movement and thought. The smallest injuries were tended with care, and the faintest cough noted with concern. Even the act of eating, simple and necessary, became a deliberate ritual, grounding men in the present moment. The dust was not merely outside, it clung to skin, clothing, and lungs, entering memory as a quiet weight. Men shared these small burdens in silence, a subtle acknowledgement of common endurance. Letters home, though sparse, carried the texture of desert days, recording not heroics, but the persistence of ordinary survival. Shadows lengthened across trenches and bunkers, offering both respite and reflection. The desert's vastness pressed against the mind, expanding awareness while emphasizing limits. And in these pauses between action, the men discovered the quiet depth of their own resilience. The air was thick, carrying both warmth and a fine haze of sand. Every step along trenches or dunes reminded the men of the desert's intimacy, of the way it entered body and thought alike. Flies clung to every surface, persistent yet strangely rhythmic, a subtle punctuation to days of still vigilance. Dysentery moved quietly, its presence a reminder of fragility and mortality, urging attention to hygiene and water. The fortress itself became a study in adaptation, each corner reflecting care and habit designed to preserve life. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and light, punctuated by dreams of home, rain, or distant rivers. Men whispered stories to pass time and to preserve connection, voices blending with the wind that rustled through sand and wire. Even humor, faint and soft, persisted, an ember against the desert's slow insistence. And in the quiet recognition of hardship, bonds grew more intricate, invisible, yet unbreakable. Rations became more than food. They were symbols of continuity, of survival sustained in small, deliberate acts. Men shared every morsel with care, learning the rhythms of giving and taking in a constrained world. Water was measured drop by drop, each sip a meditation, each flask a small anchor. The wind carried dust that seemed to settle inside lungs, eyes, and minds, reminding the men of the desert's pervasive presence. Exhaustion made movements deliberate, thoughtful, and precise, each gesture shaped by necessity. Shadows along walls and dunes became companions, offering cool relief and a sense of stability. Laughter and conversation, though softer and sparser, persisted as vital threads in the fabric of survival. Even minor victories, finding a clean bandage, securing a ration, repairing a post, became magnified in importance, and in the intimacy of shared hardship, the men discovered the quiet dignity of endurance. Time elongated under the desert sun, marked not by hours, but by breath and effort. Men counted the passing of days through routine, water measured, sand swept, trenches checked. Even the simplest tasks became exercises in focus, patience, and quiet observation. Dysentery and fatigue taught a subtle attentiveness to the body, a negotiation between energy and necessity. The desert entered memory and blood, its presence shaping thought, reflection, and emotion. Humor emerged in small sparks, shared stories, or playful observations that reminded men of their humanity. The fortress, though confined, expanded in significance, becoming a sanctuary of shared perseverance. Flies and dust, heat and exhaustion became companions in a strange rhythm of survival. And as the sun dipped toward evening, the men lay down, carried into rest by their own slow, deliberate breathing. Evenings brought a different kind of awareness, softer and more reflective. Stars appeared with clarity, their cool light a contrast to the desert's lingering warmth. Shadows shifted, and the wind brought both relief and the subtle reminder of relentless presence. Men wrote letters or whispered memories, connecting internally as much as externally. Every cough, every scratch of a fly, every careful sip of water was felt with intimate attentiveness. The fortress, dust-covered and sun-baked, became a quiet landscape of endurance. Laughter was quieter now, threading through shadows like a faint melody. The desert itself seemed to slow breathing alongside men in the trenches and dugouts. And in this slowed rhythm, the intimacy of hardship became almost luminous, a hidden light in the desert's vast expanse. The men became students of the desert, learning subtle lessons in patience, observation, and quiet adaptation. Dust clung to clothes, hands, and lips, a reminder of a world that could not be escaped, but could be endured. Each cough or faint ache prompted awareness, every ration measured with care and thought. Shadows lengthened, and the day's heat left a memory in skin and muscle. Men shared these quiet struggles without words, understanding each other in a soft, unspoken language. Sleep brought respite, though it carried the echo of the desert into dreams. Even minor gestures, offering water, passing a clean cloth, became acts of connection and affirmation. And in these small, careful interactions, the fortress pulsed with the steady rhythm of human resilience. By the end of long weeks, the desert was no longer merely around the men. It had entered their minds, their bodies, and their memories. Each breath carried the warmth and dust, each thought shaped by the slow insistence of survival. Men moved carefully through trenches, bunkers, and sand, mindful of fragility and persistence alike. Humor and companionship softened the edges of exhaustion, creating threads of connection strong enough to span the vastness outside. Letters, small rituals, and daily chores became the scaffolding of existence. The fortress hummed quietly, a living space of endurance against heat, thirst, and fatigue. Even the distant sounds of engines or artillery seemed muted against the intimate scale of daily survival. And as night returned, the desert's presence seemed to settle inside each man, a companion, teacher, and reminder of the quiet strength within. The desert around Tobruk seemed vast and silent, yet threads of connection reached invisibly through its heat and dust. Coded messages traveled carefully, each one folded into secrecy, carried along trenches, and through whispering dunes. Soldiers read and reread these slips of paper, finding in them reassurance that the world beyond still remembered their presence. The Royal Navy, slipping quietly through darkness, delivered parcels and letters with a precision that mirrored the careful movements of the defenders. Even the faintest rustle of paper or whisper of arrival felt like a breath of life in a place otherwise defined by stillness. Airdrops scattered packages into open sand, parachutes drifting like small clouds above the fortress, each one a promise of connection. Men handled these arrivals with gentle reverence, understanding that every note, every parcel, linked Tobruk to a larger story. Even in the hum of isolation, these fragile threads reminded the men of continuity, of lives and lands beyond the horizon. And as the wind shifted over dunes and wire, it carried the soft promise of words, of touch, and of memory. Letters arrived from home with a rhythm both irregular and treasured, their words soft as distant voices. Soldiers gathered to read quietly, savoring the texture of paper and the warmth of ink. Each word seemed to hum with life, reminding them of mornings and evenings far away, of familiar streets, of laughter and rain. The fortress seemed to breathe a little easier when a message was received, each note a pulse in the still rhythm of the day. Rumors traveled in parallel with official dispatches, small conversations carrying news from distant fronts, creating a lattice of quiet information. The men handled these whispers carefully, absorbing what comfort and context they could. Even parcels of small treats, extra tins or cloth, became symbols of care reaching across the vast, sun-baked expanse. They reminded the soldiers that endurance was seen, appreciated, and reinforced by hands far beyond the fortress walls. And in that soft exchange, the desert felt slightly less absolute, slightly more like a shared world. Airdrops required precise observation, patient calculation, and a careful understanding of wind and distance. Men stood quietly on ridges and open sand, eyes tracking white canopies as they floated down, guided by the breath of the desert. Each landing was a small event, handled with care to preserve the fragile contents. Letters, medicine, and supplies became talismans of hope, quietly nourishing both body and spirit. The desert wind whispered against sand and metal, carrying with it the sense that the fortress was not entirely alone. Observers noted every detail, tracking the approach of parcels with the same attentiveness reserved for the slow passage of clouds. Soldiers spoke softly, coordinating retrievals and recording the success of each drop. Even in the faintest rustle of parachute fabric, there was reassurance that the outside world continued to care. And in these moments, Tobruk's isolation softened, filled with quiet signals of persistence and attention. Messages were sometimes encoded in simple ciphers, each word chosen for protection and clarity. Soldiers bent over them, translating meaning with patience and quiet joy. A single word might carry instructions, reassurance, or news, but it always carried presence. The reminder that the world outside continued to turn. Whispered consultations accompanied every decoding, voices low and attentive, threading connection through the fortress's routine. Even when the news was minor or mundane, it became an anchor of continuity, grounding men in the broader sweep of events. The desert wind carried away excess sound, leaving only the careful rhythm of attention and comprehension. Each note, read or cipher solved, reinforced the quiet sense of purpose and place. And as the sun shifted across dunes, the fortress maintained its heartbeat, pulsing gently with every delivery, every whispered understanding. The Royal Navy's runs were themselves exercises in silent mastery. Ships crept through night and haze, slipping past watchful eyes with a combination of skill and patience. Crates and parcels were lowered gently, floating down into waiting hands that had learned to receive them with grace. Every delivery carried not only supplies but a subtle reassurance that endurance was acknowledged, that these men mattered beyond their immediate struggle. Observers along the cliffs noted each arrival, sharing quiet signals to ensure nothing was lost to wind or misstep. Even small acts, like catching a rope or guiding a crate to a safe trench, became acts of collaboration and mindfulness. The fortress, with all its walls and wire, was connected to oceans and lands far away by these careful interventions. And as each package was opened and examined, life felt slightly fuller, slightly more present, and slightly more connected. Communication became a ritual in itself, shaping the rhythm of the day. Letters, whispers, and codes were handled gently, passed from hand to hand with respect and attention. Soldiers read aloud in soft tones when needed, allowing meaning to ripple quietly through the ranks. Even routine orders from command carried weight, a reminder that strategy and care extended beyond immediate trenches. The desert, vast and still, contrasted sharply with these small pulses of life and attention. Men learned to listen not only to wind and sand, but to the subtleties of communication, the way a rustle of paper or faint creak of crate could carry meaning. Humor and comfort persisted in soft forms, threaded between decoding and reading, and in these small exchanges, the fortress became more than a circle of stone and sand. It became a conduit for connection. The quiet of the desert, once absolute, softened beneath the weight of messages delivered with care. Even routine supplies brought reassurance. A whisper of life carried on the desert wind. Fresh water, preserved food, and medicines arrived like gentle currents, easing the constant tension of scarcity. Soldiers handled these deliveries with calm deliberation, each act of distribution imbued with care and attentiveness. Packages became small symbols of hope, reminders that persistence was witnessed and supported. Letters traveled in parallel, bringing stories of distant rain, streets, and families, each word a fragile bridge across miles and isolation. The desert wind seemed to participate, moving lightly around men as they carried crates and read notes. Every whisper, every parcel, every coded message became a thread in the quiet tapestry of survival, and in handling them, the men discovered that hope itself could be gentle, subtle, and sustaining. By the close of long days, the desert resumed its near-infinite calm, holding the echoes of distant engines, rustling paper, and whispered words. Soldiers moved through trenches and bunkers with a patient attentiveness, aware of the fragile threads connecting them to the world beyond. Letters were reread, parcels checked, and codes revisited, each act reinforcing continuity and quiet hope. The wind carried dust and the faint scent of salt from distant seas, reminding men of both distance and connection. Even in exhaustion, the fortress breathed with a rhythm created by careful attention and enduring presence. And as stars appeared scattered above the vast expanse, each whisper, each message, each delivery became a soft affirmation that Tobruk was never truly alone. In this calm, enduring connection, men rested, nurtured by invisible threads that crossed desert, sand, and sky, and the fortress held itself with quiet dignity, sustained by the breath of life carried in the wind. The Mediterranean stretched beyond Tobruk, a vast expanse of blue that shimmered under the sun and deepened to indigo as night fell. Gentle waves lapped against the hulls of ships that carried life itself to the fortress, threading a fragile connection across hundreds of miles of water. The Royal Navy moved with careful precision, aware that every run held risk, and yet the rhythm of supply was relentless. Sailors learned to read subtle signs, changes in wind, the shift of waves, the faint shadow of distant vessels. Even the smallest observation could mean the difference between arrival and disaster. Crates of water, food, medicine, and letters were carried carefully on deck, each parcel treated as precious as the men it nourished. The sea seemed to breathe beneath them, a living entity, both generous and indifferent, holding secrets in its depths. Every approach to the port required patience, planning, and a quiet awareness of the invisible dangers below. And as the ships moved steadily forward, the men understood that endurance was not only measured in trenches and sand, but across rolling waters. The horizon was a slow pulse, the rhythm of waves marking the passage of time and distance. Men leaned against railings, feeling salt spray against sun-warmed skin, the breeze carrying both relief and tension. Every movement of the ship was deliberate, practiced, and attentive. Ropes tightened, sails adjusted, engines monitored. Orders were whispered in tones calibrated for both clarity and quiet, preserving focus in the low hum of the vessel. Lookouts scanned the expanse, eyes catching the slightest glint of sunlight on distant metal, or a subtle disturbance in the water. Even the hum of the engine seemed to echo across the open sea, a measured heartbeat in the larger rhythm of survival. Supplies were arranged meticulously, each crate accounted for, each barrel carefully secured. The men handled cargo with reverence, mindful that each delivery could sustain weeks of endurance back at Tobruk. And in this quiet balance, the sea itself felt alive, a partner in both peril and provision. Nights on the Mediterranean carried a different kind of vigilance. The darkness deepened the contrast between calm and hidden danger, and sailors moved with heightened awareness. Stars glittered like distant lanterns, reflections dancing on gentle waves, offering both guidance and a quiet reminder of distance from home. Navigation required patience and subtle skill, reading currents, the wind, and faint landmarks against the horizon. Every turn of the ship, every adjustment of course was deliberate, a dialogue with the sea itself. Supplies were lowered carefully for eventual transfer, and every package became a promise of life delivered. Quiet rituals of care persisted, routines honed over months of practice, reinforcing discipline and calm. Even conversations were measured, soft and precise, threading a shared understanding through the crew. And as dawn approached, the gentle swell of the sea carried both anticipation and relief, connecting men to the fortress awaiting them. The interface between land and water created a delicate tension. Convoys approached Tobruk with quiet care, aware that the fortress's survival depended on their success. The blue expanse met golden dunes in a line of fragile hope, a border both beautiful and dangerous. Sailors and soldiers alike felt this tension, the calm above masking the complexity below. Every crate lowered from ship to shore, every message carried inland, became a testament to careful endurance. The Mediterranean, infinite in its breadth, offered both sustenance and challenge, demanding vigilance and patience from all who traversed it. Even the gentle rocking of the vessels became part of a rhythm, teaching balance and subtle observation. Men whispered, coordinated, and handled tasks with the care of those who understood that small mistakes could ripple into consequence. And as waves met the shore, the desert beyond seemed to inhale the quiet strength of these maritime efforts. The sea carried stories in its quiet waves, tales of past voyages, of storms weathered and distance covered, drifted through the minds of those aboard. Even the hum of engines felt like a low chorus, blending with the lapping of waves and the creak of timbers. Supplies, letters, and messages were more than cargo. They were lifelines threaded through the expanse of water. The horizon, endless yet intimate, reminded sailors that their labor connected them to a human network far beyond the desert walls. Even small gestures, securing a crate, noting a landmark, adjusting a line, became deliberate acts of stewardship and care. Quiet reflection intertwined with duty, and every man became both observer and participant in the delicate dance of survival. And as night fell again, the Mediterranean seemed to hold its breath, carrying hope silently toward Tobruk. Convoys moved with a rhythm shaped by anticipation and experience. Each wave, each gust of wind, became a signal to adjust, to prepare, and to act with calm precision. Sailors tracked distant vessels and shadows, reading the sea as carefully as any map. Messages from command were decoded quietly, maintaining connection between fortress and fleet. Crates were counted, secured, and rechecked, each step reinforcing both material and moral endurance. Even the occasional lull offered lessons, as men noted patterns in waves, wind, and horizon, refining their understanding of the sea's subtle moods. The interplay of salt, sun, and horizon created a sensory rhythm that carried both calm and alertness. And as the convoy drew closer to port, the promise of delivery intertwined with the quiet beauty of the Mediterranean night. The approach to Tobruk required patience and soft attentiveness. Ships slowed, aligning carefully with the natural currents and channels, maintaining a quiet vigilance that spoke of both expertise and respect for the environment. Every landing was choreographed, measured, and deliberate, with men coordinating silently to ensure success. Cargo was lowered gently onto waiting hands, and letters passed inland with quiet ceremony. Even the faintest ripple of water or change in wind carried information, interpreted instinctively by those who had learned the sea's language. Observers along the cliffs noted arrivals, providing subtle guidance and reassurance. The fortress in turn responded with careful planning, ready to receive, protect, and distribute supplies. And in this delicate balance, the sea, the desert, and the fortress existed in a quiet, interwoven rhythm of endurance. By the end of long days, the Mediterranean settled into a gentle lull. Waves rolled steadily against hulls and shore, carrying salt and reflection across the expanse. The fortress absorbed every delivery, each crate, each note, each drop of water, a pulse of life, threading through trenches and bunkers. Sailors rested on deck, mindful of the day's labor and alert for the next approach. Stars glittered overhead, the night sea reflecting faint light that illuminated both water and sand. Even silence became meaningful, a moment of connection between human effort and natural rhythm. The wind carried faint stories across dunes, mixing with the desert's heat and memory. And as the fortress settled into evening, the quiet success of supply and endurance reminded all that life persisted, carried gently across both sea and sand. Rommel moved across the dunes with a careful intensity, his plans precise and measured, yet always tested by the unpredictability of sand and sun. His strategies, brilliant on paper, encountered a fortress that seemed to anticipate the desert itself. Every assault, every maneuver, felt like a dialogue with both landscape and human endurance, a negotiation between ambition and patience. Mirages rose along the horizon, not only of shimmering heat, but of expectations that dissolved upon closer approach. The defenders observed quietly, adapting with calm focus, turning each advance into an opportunity for patience to triumph. Even Rommel, the desert fox, felt the subtle tension of uncertainty pressing against his calculations. The sand shifted under tanks and footsteps alike, reminding all that control is fleeting in a land governed by nature as much as by human will. Orders were delivered, adjustments made, and yet the fortress held, an anchor of resolve amidst the shifting illusion. And in these hours, the desert revealed the delicate balance between brilliance and endurance. The horizon seemed alive with promise and deception. Rommel's forces advanced in patterns designed to overwhelm, yet the men within Tobruk read the signals with quiet care. Every flash of movement across the dunes was noted, measured, and met with appropriate restraint. The sand itself became a mirror, reflecting both the ambition of attack and the patient calm of defense. Soldiers moved with careful rhythm, tending to trenches, reinforcing walls, and maintaining observation, each act a quiet assertion against the illusion of imminent defeat. Even the sun, relentless and bright, cast long shadows that shifted perception and challenged expectation. Reports flowed steadily, quietly reinforcing that the fortress was not simply surviving, but anticipating. And as the day waned, the desert fox began to sense the subtle power of patience, a force that often outlasts even the sharpest mind. Mirages played tricks not only on eyes but on morale. Rommel's clever plans sometimes appeared within reach, only to dissipate like water over hot sand. The defenders, in contrast, moved with measured calm, their discipline shaped by repetition and quiet observation. Every trench and wire became a testament to foresight, every corner of the fortress a quiet mirror of endurance. Men shared small routines, laughing softly over minor discomforts, reinforcing cohesion without fanfare. The desert itself seemed to test both sides, reflecting brilliance and patience in equal measure. Even distant sounds, subtle and low, carried significance, interpreted with care by those attuned to the land's language. Rommel adjusted, recalculated, and probed again, yet the fortress absorbed each test without yielding. And in this rhythm of advance and pause, the mirage of control slowly revealed its transient nature. The battle of minds unfolded alongside the battle of sand and steel. Rommel's reputation demanded rapid success, yet the fortress's quiet endurance drew out each engagement, reshaping expectation. Decisions made under pressure were filtered through both skill and uncertainty, producing moments of subtle tension. Men in Tobruk worked tirelessly yet calmly, reinforcing walls, checking supplies, and observing the dunes with gentle attentiveness. Even in the heat of day, the desert's presence demanded respect, reminding all that human ambition is measured in conversation with nature. Mirages appeared in heat waves, in distant glints of metal, in imagined lines of tanks, sometimes real, sometimes illusion. The desert fox learned that brilliance can be slowed, even softened, by patience and quiet observation. And as night approached, the fortress remained intact, its calm presence a quiet counterpoint to Rommel's restless calculations. Sustained observation became a tool as powerful as any weapon. Soldiers noted the faintest traces of movement across sand and ridge, translating small changes into meaningful decisions. Rommel, aware of their attention, attempted diversions and feints, testing both terrain and resolve. Yet the men inside Tobruk responded with steady rhythm, countering uncertainty with quiet knowledge of their own environment. Even the desert wind seemed to carry lessons, rustling wire and sand alike, whispering subtle cues to those who listened. Routine tasks, reinforcing trenches, distributing water, tending small injuries, became acts of psychological reassurance, quiet assertions that control existed within. The balance between anticipation and observation created a rhythm, unhurried yet alert, shaping every decision in both camps. And as stars emerged overhead, the mirage of instant victory softened into the enduring certainty of patience and resilience. Rommel's frustration grew, subtle yet insistent. Every advance met preparation, every illusion of weakness countered by the fortress's quiet resolve. Even the shifting sands, once allies to speed and deception, revealed the limits of rapid movement against careful observation. Men inside Tobruk walked, wrote, spoke softly, laughed faintly, and observed constantly, creating a human pulse beneath stone and wire. Messages flowed along trenches, letters arrived from supply runs, and the air itself seemed to carry reassurance. Mirages, whether of tanks, distant fires, or imagined gaps, faded before they could unsettle the defenders. And in this interplay between brilliance and endurance, the desert itself became teacher, revealing that even the most clever designs can be slowed by quiet patience. Every attempt by Rommel to press advantage became another lesson in restraint and observation. The fortress absorbed pressure, redistributed energy, and maintained calm, turning the desert fox's cunning into a study of human and environmental rhythm. Soldiers adjusted positions, repaired wire, and reinforced walls with deliberate intent, each act a quiet assertion of permanence. Even subtle changes in wind or temperature became signals interpreted with patience and care. The mirage of control shimmered and dissolved in the heat, leaving only endurance and observation in its wake. Communication within the fortress moved softly, steadily, sustaining the rhythm of attention. And as the sun dipped low, coloring sand and stone in muted gold, the desert held both the mirage and the reality together in quiet tension. By the close of day, the desert fox confronted the truth of his pursuit. Plans, strategies, and brilliance met a fortress shaped by patience, rhythm, and subtle endurance. The desert, vast and indifferent, revealed that mastery is never absolute, that even genius can be tested by quiet persistence. Soldiers moved through the remaining hours with gentle focus, reading the wind, observing the sand, and tending to their environment with deliberate care. Even small rituals, sips of water, a whispered conversation, or the placement of sandbags, became acts of psychological strength. Mirages shimmered one last time on the horizon, then softened as evening approached. The fortress pulsed steadily with the rhythm of human resilience, absorbing tension without haste or alarm. And as night fell, the desert fox's illusions met the desert's quiet lesson. Brilliance must always yield in part to the enduring power of patience. Night draped itself over the desert like a silken veil, softening the edges of sand and stone, and transforming Tobruk into a quiet, almost mystical landscape. Flares floated slowly through the dark sky, their pale light tracing fleeting shapes over dunes and wire, as though painting the desert with gentle strokes of silver. Soldiers moved in careful rhythm along the trenches, their steps measured, deliberate, a quiet counterpoint to the shimmer of light above. The wind shifted subtly, carrying the faint scent of sand and salt from the distant Mediterranean, brushing across faces and the open expanse of the fortress. Patrols slipped along wire and earth, moving like shadows in a slow, intimate dance. Each movement was mindful, attuned to the stillness that enveloped the night, and each step felt magnified in the desert's hush. Even the faint rustle of fabric, the soft scrape of boots, seemed part of the natural rhythm, blending into the low murmur of distant flares. The moon hung fractured above, a silvered witness to endurance, reflecting across dunes in quiet patterns of light and shadow. And in this slowed, delicate space, time seemed to pause, allowing both land and men to breathe together. Silhouettes emerged in the dim glow, stretching across wire and sand, each figure absorbed in purpose and quiet observation. Conversations were whispers, carried only by the ears closest, threading a sense of connection without breaking the spell of stillness. Men paused to listen, not only to one another, but to the subtle sounds of desert night, the whisper of wind, the faint shift of sand, the distant sigh of waves. Flares traced patterns in the sky that were both beautiful and functional, illuminating small sections of the fortress, while leaving others in gentle shadow. Even routine tasks, checking trenches, reinforcing barriers, observing lines, became moments of meditation, each gesture deliberate and precise. Shadows moved and merged, forming shapes that seemed almost dreamlike against the quiet expanse of sand. Each man carried both vigilance and fatigue, balancing the need to observe with the need to remain calm and steady. And as the broken moon traced its path above, the desert itself seemed to exhale, drawing everyone into its gentle rhythm of night. The earth beneath boots and hands felt different under the moonlight, cooler and soft, each step registering more consciously. Patrols unfolded slowly, moving along familiar paths that became a choreography of awareness, both protective and serene. The wind whispered through trenches and wire, carrying subtle shifts in scent and temperature that guided careful attention. The desert's contours appeared softened, reshaped by silver light, offering both concealment and clarity in equal measure. Flashes of distant illumination, whether from distant activity or faint reflections, were noted quietly, their presence enhancing rather than alarming. Even silence held texture, filled with the low hum of anticipation, the occasional murmur of men coordinating with care. Letters and small messages passed along lines of trenches, reaching hands with the same delicacy as the night itself. And in this interplay of shadow and light, men moved almost as extensions of the desert, their presence gentle yet enduring. The broken moon traced arcs across dunes and walls, scattering light that shifted the perception of space and distance. Soldiers adjusted, paused, and observed, attuned to the subtle cues of movement and shadow. Flares revealed small sections, throwing delicate detail into relief while leaving surrounding areas soft and undefined. Even routine observations, checking supplies, noting footprints, inspecting wire, became imbued with the quiet intimacy of night. Every gesture was precise, blending care and patience, a harmony with the rhythm of desert darkness. The cool night air brushed against skin, carrying both the scent of sand and the distant muted resonance of activity beyond the fortress. Whispered words, careful movements, and shared awareness created a gentle cohesion among those patrolling. And as the night deepened, the desert's pulse seemed to slow, stretching the hours into a long contemplative expanse. Flares hovered, like slow-moving lanterns, drifting across sand and sky with a deliberate, quiet grace. Their light revealed fleeting glimpses of men, walls, and dunes, creating shifting patterns that mirrored the delicate tension of the night. Patrols passed under this glow, moving silently, listening, observing, responding to subtle cues with the same care they might devote to reading a page. Even the faintest movement of sand was noted, a gentle reminder of the desert's constant presence. Night's coolness offered relief from the sun's relentless heat, allowing muscles to relax slightly, while attention remained alert. Letters passed along quiet lines were handled with deliberate tenderness, small gestures affirming connection and reassurance. The fortress seemed to breathe slowly with its inhabitants, a living space shaped by attention, care, and patience. And under the broken moon, the desert and the men existed in a shared rhythm, quiet yet profoundly alive. Sounds became textures in the night. The scrape of boots, the rustle of clothing, the low murmur of coordinated whispers. Each carried weight and meaning, subtle indicators of presence and movement that were as vital as any instrument of defense. Flares illuminated, then faded, revealing a desert softened into silvered mystery. Patrols observed, reported, and moved with deliberation, blending vigilance with calm reflection. Shadows stretched and contracted across dunes and trenches, creating a dreamlike sense of fluid space. Men felt the coolness of the night against their skin, the delicate press of wind across faces and hands, grounding them in both body and environment. Even the distant lapping of waves along the coast became part of the night's quiet rhythm. And as hours passed, the desert's stillness seemed to deepen, enfolding both fortress and men in a gentle, persistent calm. Small rituals persisted beneath the broken moon, lending continuity and structure to night's unfolding. Supplies were checked, letters distributed, patrols coordinated, all with soft attentiveness. Men moved in careful synchrony, each gesture part of an unspoken harmony with the desert's rhythm. Flares and shadow created a dance of visibility and concealment, shaping perception and awareness. Every observation, however minor, reinforced both safety and the meditative quality of prolonged presence. The cool, scented air and the shifting light encouraged reflection, drawing attention inward as well as outward. Even laughter, faint and careful, found its place, threading humanity through the dreamlike night. And as the moon traced its fractured path across dunes and wire, the desert seemed to pause with them, breathing slowly in shared quietude. By the final hours of night, Tobruk rested in a suspended calm. Flares dwindled, shadows merged, and the broken moon lingered softly above the fortress and dunes. Soldiers moved slowly through trenches, observing, whispering, and tending small tasks with gentle care. The desert seemed to breathe with them, inhaling and exhaling in soft pulses that marked time differently from the day. Letters and small messages lay ready for morning, a quiet assurance that continuity persisted even under darkness. The wind shifted lightly, carrying faint scents and the subtle murmur of distant waves, threading the night with awareness. Even the most minor movements felt magnified, each step a gentle assertion of presence and endurance. And as the first pale hints of dawn began to touch the horizon, the night's dreamlike rhythm gave way slowly, carrying the fortress and its men into another day beneath the desert's quiet embrace. Time in Tobruk folded into itself, measured not in days or hours, but in the slow sweep of dust across sand and the careful rationing of tins. The sun rose and fell over dunes and wire with unwavering patience, marking the passage of months in golden and silvered light. Letters that had once arrived with delicate frequency grew fewer, until silence became another companion in the fortress. Soldiers moved through routines with gentle precision, finding comfort in repetition and the quiet rhythm of care. Even small gestures, passing a cup of water, adjusting a blanket, checking a supply, became rituals of endurance and presence. The desert, vast and unchanging, absorbed these motions, its silence weaving a sense of sacredness around every trench and wall. The wind carried grains of sand like whispers, shifting slowly across the fortress, reminding men that time was both immobile and moving. In these moments, patience became tangible, shaping both body and mind. A quiet meditation within the siege. And as the sun traced its arc, the fortress existed suspended, held by its own calm and the desert's infinite gaze. Dust storms came and went, blurring horizons and softening the edges of trenches, transforming familiar lines into flowing landscapes. Soldiers learned to read the sky and sand, noticing subtle shifts in wind or the faint shimmer of heat on distant dunes. Even the harshest storms became predictable, their rhythm measured and internalized, another marker of passing time. Rations were carefully accounted for, shared and stretched with quiet discipline, becoming both necessity and ritual. Men wrote in journals, etched small notes into wood or paper, preserving the continuity of their presence and thoughts. Conversations slowed, measured in whispers or gentle tones, each word chosen for calm and clarity. The desert's silence deepened during these storms, muffling distant sounds and emphasizing the hushed, deliberate pulse of life within the fortress. Even sleep was shaped by these rhythms, fragmented yet tender, as men adapted to nature's quiet insistence. And in this daily endurance, hope took the form of ritual, subtle and sustaining, threading through every gesture and glance. The absence of letters grew into its own presence, a quiet weight that shaped attention and reflection. Men paused, noticing the void where distant voices had once arrived, feeling the subtle tension of connection suspended. Even in stillness, the fortress remained attentive, ready to receive any sign from beyond the desert. Supplies were monitored carefully, each tin and bottle a small marker of continuity and survival. Soldiers whispered stories of home past routines, remembered streets and imagined laughter, threading memory through the long silence. Every gesture, folding clothes, smoothing blankets, adjusting wire, became a meditation on the passage of time. The sun painted dunes with muted golds and soft shadows, blending sand and horizon into one continuous expanse. And as the desert's quiet deepened, the men felt their own patience stretching, attuning them to the subtle rhythms of waiting. Routines took on sacred qualities. Each repetition a meditation, each observation an affirmation of presence. Even meals, modest and carefully shared, became rituals of connection, grounding soldiers in the shared rhythm of survival. Small chores, like sweeping sand from floors, checking water, or recording observations, acquired gentle significance, anchoring time in deliberate motion. Conversations, rare and quiet, were infused with reflection and gentle humor, a soft tether to human continuity. The desert wind whispered through wire and dune, threading every task with a sense of attentive calm. Even the distant glimmer of sun on sand seemed to mark the passage of both moments and months, unnoticed yet persistently present. Soldiers adapted to stillness as if learning a language, listening to the silence for cues and signs. Each night the stars emerged steadily, unchanging yet intimate, a quiet companion in months of patient endurance. And as the sun traced its slow descent each day, the fortress seemed suspended in its own rhythm, poised between what was and what might come. The quiet revealed small acts of beauty, hidden within endurance. Soldiers arranged flowers from rare desert blooms, smoothed edges of cloth, or polished small personal items with care, tenderly attending to life amidst dust and wire. Each small action became a meditation, a gentle assertion of agency within the unchanging landscape. Even letters, when found tucked in supply crates or notes left by patrols, were handled reverently, their absence or presence shaping both hope and reflection. Shadows stretched long across dunes, blending lines of trench and horizon into a seamless flow of muted color. Men listened to the wind, noting its whisper against walls, wire, and earth, finding continuity in subtle, imperceptible shifts. Time itself seemed to breathe with the desert, inhaling slowly and releasing with measured patience. Conversations, when they occurred, were quiet and deliberate, often reflective, threading memory and observation together. And as the moon rose fractured and gentle above the dunes, the fortress rested in a sacred rhythm of endurance and calm. Moments of stillness became markers of presence and reflection. Soldiers paused to observe sand patterns, note shifts in wind, or track the movement of distant clouds. Each small observation reinforced the quiet awareness that life persisted, sustained by patience and attention. The sun's heat softened in early morning and evening, blending color and shadow in gentle gradients across the fortress and dunes. Water was rationed, shared and appreciated, in slow, deliberate sips, becoming both necessity and meditation. Every minor task, from adjusting wire to smoothing sand, carried weight, a gentle assertion of human presence within the vast, unchanging desert. Even laughter, rare and soft, threaded warmth into the stillness, connecting men across space and time. The desert itself seemed to approve, its quiet rhythm echoing through trenches and pathways. And as days blurred into one another, the fortress existed in a suspended meditative calm, anchored by ritual and attentive endurance. Letters and parcels, when they appeared, became almost sacred events, brief disruptions of silence threaded with hope. Men handled each arrival with reverence, reading and rereading in hushed tones, absorbing the faint connection from beyond the dunes. Each message, however small, was a tether to continuity, a delicate reminder that the world extended beyond sand and wire. Observations of wind and horizon became more attuned, each detail amplified in significance against the backdrop of waiting. Even the routine distribution of rations became a gentle exercise in mindfulness, affirming both generosity and presence. Soldiers moved deliberately, speaking softly, noticing the smallest sounds, gestures, and changes around them. The desert, patient and expansive, held these rhythms without judgment, reinforcing the sacredness of suspended time. And as the sun dipped low behind distant ridges, the fortress inhaled the calm, letting endurance flow through every wall and step. By the closing days of this extended stillness, Tobruk seemed to exist in a realm apart, where time was measured in subtle winds and the movement of dust across dunes. Men moved with quiet purpose, observing, adjusting, and tending to both necessity and ritual. Each ration, each sip of water, each whispered word was an anchor in the endless expanse of sand. The desert's silence, vast and encompassing, carried a weight both meditative and protective, a soft blanket over body and spirit. Even minor chores became affirmations of life, gentle assertions of presence in a landscape defined by patience. Letters and messages, when they arrived, were threads woven delicately into the fortress's continuity. And as night fell, Stars scattered across the sky like gentle sparks of memory and hope. The fortress held itself in a sacred stillness. In this calm, enduring rhythm, soldiers found the quiet heart of the siege, suspended beneath the unchanging desert sky, poised for what would come. The desert held its quiet vigil, golden waves stretching endlessly, when the distant hum of engines began to ripple across the dunes. Rumors arrived in fragments, whispers of tanks moving, allied forces stirring beyond the horizon, a sense of anticipation threading through the fortress. Soldiers paused in their routines, listening to the wind and horizon, attuned to the faintest shift in rhythm that might carry news of approaching relief. Even the sand seemed to hold its breath, waiting for motion to break the stillness that had long defined life at Tobruk. Rations were distributed with the same careful calm, yet the hands carrying them trembled slightly with subtle excitement. Reports trickled in slowly, bringing glimpses of distant thunder, the promise that the siege's long monotony might soon be disrupted. The men read maps, spoke softly of possibilities, and adjusted observation points with quiet precision. Even casual conversation carried tension, woven with hope and caution, and as the sun rose, painting dunes with a pale gold, the desert seemed ready to shift once again, carrying history forward in its silent expanse. Allied tanks, once distant and abstract, began to shape the horizon into moving lines of determination. The wind carried the faint metallic scent of engines and the subtle vibration of tracks over sand, a rhythm both alien and reassuring. Soldiers watched, attentive yet patient, as the landscape transformed under this new motion. Dust rose in gentle plumes, signaling movement far beyond fortress walls, each particle a tiny messenger of hope. Even distant artillery, muted across vast dunes, became a steady heartbeat, threading tension through both mind and body. Men adjusted positions, checking wire and trenches, yet their movements held a measured calm, balancing anticipation with endurance. Letters, journals, and small notes were tucked away as routines persisted, quietly anchoring the human thread amidst shifting landscapes. And as day lengthened, the desert seemed to pulse softly, carrying the promise of relief across sun-warmed sand and wind-shaped dunes. Rumors of progress arrived with each breeze, hints of advances and setbacks filtering through the fortress in measured whispers. Soldiers leaned toward one another, sharing careful observations, aware that even small news carried weight. Maps were consulted, coordinates compared, and minor adjustments made to patrols and observation points, all in the quiet cadence of preparation. The horizon shimmered with heat and dust, a mirror reflecting both reality and the imagination of men eager for change. Even mundane tasks, from checking supplies to repairing small damage, carried an undercurrent of alert awareness. Conversation threaded through moments of stillness, soft and deliberate, blending hope with cautious observation. The desert absorbed all activity, unchanging yet responsive, a patient partner in human anticipation. And as the sun descended in pale gold and muted amber, the fortress felt the subtle swell of history moving closer with each passing hour. Tanks traced sinuous lines across dunes, their slow advance mirrored by the careful observation within Tobruk. Dust rose and lingered, softening the edges of steel and sand, transforming movement into a gentle rhythm of approach. Men observed quietly, noting patterns and shifts, sensing the pulse of a larger plan, taking shape beyond their walls. Even small sounds, the scrape of metal on sand, the low hum of engines carried significance, shaping both expectation and attention. The desert's heat softened in late afternoon, casting long shadows that merged with dunes, creating shapes both familiar and strange. Patrols moved with deliberate steps, adjusting routines to align with the subtle rhythm of distant progress. Letters, journals, and whispered notes carried reflections of hope, careful musings, and quiet excitement threaded through months of waiting. And as evening approached, the desert seemed to inhale, holding the fortress and its men in a shared anticipation of what would come. The movement beyond the fortress encouraged subtle shifts in strategy, minor adjustments in position, and gentle rotations of men on watch. Each decision was measured, reflecting both experience and cautious optimism. The horizon, softened by dust and heat, revealed patterns and breaks in the desert's monotony, suggesting new possibilities in the long siege. Even the faintest vibrations carried meaning, interpreted with quiet care and attention to rhythm. Men shared observations softly, leaning on shared knowledge while maintaining focus on the calm within. The desert's vast expanse seemed to stretch and contract, absorbing energy, attention, and hope, creating a space where both human and landscape worked in subtle harmony. Flares in the far distance traced temporary lines of light across dunes, gentle markers of coordination and movement, and as night approached, the fortress rested in an expanded sense of awareness, attuned to distant engines and the quiet rhythm of advancing relief. Small rituals persisted amidst rising anticipation, anchoring men in the daily cadence that had sustained them for months. Meals were shared with careful attention, water rationed delicately, and minor repairs conducted in the soft glow of early evening. Even brief exchanges carried weight, threads of conversation, reinforcing trust and endurance in the face of uncertainty. Soldiers noted the patterns of dust and wind, the faint shimmer of heat along distant ridges, and the subtle changes in the horizon's contour. The desert itself seemed to hum with quiet tension, a gentle acknowledgement of both human perseverance and the approaching tide of history. Letters were read and reread in whispers, carrying news, encouragement, and the faint pulse of connection beyond the walls. The rhythm of preparation blended with the rhythm of expectation, creating a meditative cadence in every step, gesture, and breath. And as the last light of sun melted into dusk, the fortress held a suspended energy, poised for the unfolding of events beyond its walls. Reports of skirmishes and minor advances filtered through the desert like soft ripples, touching the edges of the fortress with news of movement. Soldiers moved slowly, integrating this information with observation, adjusting focus with calm attentiveness. Even the faintest sounds or distant lights were noted, interpreted as part of a larger unfolding story. Dust rose in slow, continuous swirls, carrying both literal and figurative signals of progress across dunes and ridgelines. Men shared quiet reflections, memories, and careful conjectures, threading hope through the fortress without haste or alarm. The rhythm of night began to settle over the desert, gentle and reflective, carrying both anticipation and patience. Letters, journals, and minor observations acted as quiet anchors, stabilizing attention amidst the shifting landscape of distant movement. And as stars emerged over sand and wire, the fortress rested in a balanced awareness, attuned to the first subtle stirrings of relief. By the close of day, Operation Crusader's presence was tangible. Though the desert's calm persisted around it, tanks moved steadily, distant thunder echoed softly, and patrols whispered observations along trenches and wire. Men prepared with measured care, observing, adjusting, and sustaining routines while attending to the quiet pulse of relief approaching. Dust, wind, and horizon worked together, creating a space both serene and expectant. Letters and journals carried thoughts and quiet reflections, maintaining continuity within the fortress and reinforcing patient endurance. Even casual gestures, a shared smile, A gentle adjustment of gear, a careful inspection of wire, carried subtle significance, threading hope through daily life. The sun set in muted colors, painting dunes and walls in soft amber and silvered gray, merging sand, steel, and horizon in gentle calm. And as night enveloped Tobruk, the fortress seemed to inhale, holding both its own endurance and the promise of approaching relief in a suspended meditative rhythm. The sun rose over Tobruk in gentle light, casting long, quiet shadows across trenches and wire that had been held for 241 days. Dust clung to walls and uniforms, a subtle reminder of the long vigil, yet the air held a softness, a sense of something shifting beyond routine. Reports arrived slowly, measured and deliberate, hinting that the enemy was pulling back, that the circle drawn so tightly around the fortress was beginning to loosen. Soldiers moved with calm attentiveness, adjusting positions and checking trenches, yet their gestures carried a new weight, an unspoken anticipation of what the morning might reveal. The wind carried faint smells of the desert, warmed by sun and softened by distance, and each breath seemed to mingle relief and disbelief. Gates that had once been heavily guarded now waited, unshuttered, inviting cautious observation without fanfare. Men paused to notice the subtle changes in horizon and ridge, attuned to signs long trained to read. The silence of the desert stretched, enfolding the fortress in a delicate, almost surreal calm. And in that space between observation and realization, the possibility of freedom seemed tangible, yet dreamlike. Movement beyond the walls was slow and deliberate, the enemy retreating in patterns, familiar yet softened by distance and time. Soldiers observed with careful eyes, noting the faint tracks in sand, the shifting shadows across dunes, the low hum of vehicles in retreat. The fortress had grown accustomed to tension, to the rhythm of siege, and now that rhythm shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. Men exchanged quiet glances, acknowledging one another with soft nods, their relief measured, internalized, rather than loudly expressed. Dust rose gently with each distant movement, a pale echo of the past months, carrying both memory and present change. Routine tasks continued, but they felt different, infused with a calm awareness that the siege's long wait was easing. Letters and notes, once rare, were handled with renewed care, small signs of continuity and life threading through the unfolding quiet. And as the sun climbed higher, gilding dunes and wire with muted warmth, the fortress inhaled the calm, preparing for the subtle arrival of liberation. The first realization spread slowly through the fortress, subtle and tender, like the desert wind tracing over sand. Soldiers paused, leaning on walls or wire, feeling the absence of distant pressure, noticing the faint stillness left in the enemy's wake. Even routine movements, adjusting blankets, checking water, moving along trenches, felt heavier with awareness, each step a meditation on endurance and survival. The wind carried a whisper of change, a quiet chorus of release that threaded through every corridor and path. Conversation remained hushed, soft tones reflecting both astonishment and measured acknowledgement. The horizon, once tense with expectation and threat, now held soft lines of retreat, blending sand, sky, and motion into gentle patterns. Shadows lengthened, revealing the faint tracks of vehicles and men, tangible proof that the siege's weight was lifting. And as the day unfolded, the fortress seemed to exhale collectively, absorbing relief in gentle, deliberate breaths. Soldiers moved slowly toward the gates, their steps measured, deliberate, almost ceremonial in their quiet observance. The wire, once taut and formidable, now seemed softened by distance and time, a reminder of both vigilance and patience. Dunes shimmered under the sun, pale and unchanging. carrying the echo of months past and the subtle pulse of present freedom. Men brushed dust from shoulders and faces, feeling the long weight of endurance ease with each gesture. Even the faintest movement, a lifted lid, a creak of wood, the whisper of sand under boots, felt significant, marking the transition from siege to open space. Letters and journals were quietly consulted, reflections woven through months of endurance, now illuminated with the soft glow of realized hope. Conversations, gentle and sparse, reflected measured disbelief and careful joy, threads connecting human observation with larger history. And as gates opened slowly, the fortress held its breath, observing the unfolding quiet with the same deliberate attention that had carried it through months of siege. The retreating enemy left traces in the sand, faint patterns that spoke softly of withdrawal, of the shifting weight of conflict. Soldiers followed these traces with careful eyes, attentive to signs long trained to read, yet noticing them with an almost meditative patience. Dust swirled lightly around boots and wire, mingling with wind and sun, softening the landscape even as it revealed subtle evidence of change. The fortress breathed in harmony with the desert, absorbing the quiet, almost unreal relief that rose like a gentle tide. Even minor gestures, adjusting blankets, straightening wire, checking small supplies, carried significance, anchoring the human presence in the new reality. Conversations remained hushed, threaded with quiet reflection and gentle acknowledgement of endurance completed. The sun shifted toward afternoon, gilding dunes and walls with soft amber, painting the scene in muted warmth. And in that slow passage of light and observation, the realization of breaking free settled delicate and profound across the fortress and the desert beyond. Men paused often, letting the moment linger, feeling the delicate tension of disbelief unravel into calm understanding. Steps slowed, eyes scanned distant ridges, and hands rested lightly on familiar walls, absorbing the gentle rhythm of liberation. Even routine checks of trenches and wire became moments of reflection, mindful of every month endured and every observation noted. Dust rose in pale plumes, stirred by wind and gentle movement, tracing patterns across sand that mirrored the quiet satisfaction in the men's hearts. Conversations, whispers of memory and endurance, threaded through the fortress like soft music, delicate and sustaining. The sun painted gentle shadows along walls and dunes, merging space and light into harmonious calm. Men allowed themselves to breathe deeply, inhaling relief as the fortress held itself steady in patient observation. And as the gates fully opened, the desert itself seemed to exhale, carrying both history and quiet triumph across sand, wire, and sky. Letters and journals became focal points for reflection, small artifacts of endurance now imbued with the soft glow of realization. Men read passages aloud in hushed tones, sharing memories and careful observation, weaving past and present into gentle continuity. Even the faintest gestures, a shared smile, a careful adjustment of gear, a pause to observe wind or sun, carried quiet significance. The desert's warmth pressed softly on skin and uniform, a tangible companion in both history and calm reflection. Shadows merged, lines softened, and distant movement became gentle patterns of retreat and space. Soldiers lingered in the rhythm of endurance, absorbing the subtle transition from confinement to freedom with measured attention. The horizon seemed expanded, stretched by distance and reflection, carrying both memory and anticipation. And as evening approached, the fortress rested in quiet triumph, embracing the long, slow release of months compressed into gentle realization. By nightfall, Tobruk held itself in reflective calm, absorbing both relief and the weight of memory. Dust settled, sand shifted softly under wind, and men moved with gentle precision, careful not to disturb the delicate rhythm of the moment. Conversations were whispers, shared observations threaded with reflection and quiet acknowledgement. The gates, now open, marked not just passage, but a gentle assertion of endurance and history. The desert exhaled, carrying heat, dust, and shadow in a muted symphony across dunes and wire. Soldiers paused in trenches, along walls, and atop ridges, breathing deeply, feeling the long siege settle into memory. Letters and journals remained close, reminders of both time past and time endured. And as stars emerged over sand and fortress alike, Tobruk rested in a meditative calm, a place suspended between survival, relief, and the desert's eternal rhythm. The sun dipped low over Tobruk, painting the desert in soft amber and muted gold, revealing the slow reclamation of sand across trenches and walls. Dust crept into every crevice, threading across the fortress, as if smoothing the edges of months-long endurance. Soldiers walked slowly through empty corridors, pausing to touch walls, gates, and remnants of life that had endured the siege. The wind carried faint whispers of memory, stirring sand over supplies, equipment, and scattered personal items left behind in the quiet hurry of movement. Tanks once imposing now sat half-buried, softened by the desert's patient persistence, their steel muted under layers of fine sand. Medals, journals, and personal effects, carefully preserved by human hands, lay quietly dusted, the desert gently reclaiming history in its own deliberate rhythm. Even the air carried the scent of sand and sun, a warm, dry acknowledgement of absence and endurance. And as shadows lengthened, the fortress exhaled, standing still, a quiet witness to both human courage and the desert's unyielding passage of time. The landscape beyond the walls bore subtle scars, hummocks of disturbed sand, and the outlines of paths once travelled, softened now under the desert's persistent touch. Soldiers moved with careful attention, observing the contours of dunes, noticing how wind and light transformed familiar terrain into shapes both strange and tender. Each footprint left in haste or habit was slowly erased, a gentle lesson in impermanence, carried across sun-warmed sand. Wire once taut and vigilant, sagged under months of abandonment, quietly bowing to the desert's patient reclaiming. Small objects once vital to survival, tins, tools, letters, lay softened and still, their forms absorbed into patterns of dust and heat. Men lingered in reflection, speaking softly or in silence, letting the weight of endurance settle into memory. The desert moved subtly, grains drifting over walls and roads, reshaping them with gentle insistence. And as light softened further, the fortress felt suspended between past vigilance and present stillness, a meditation of stone, sand, and human memory. Echoes of footsteps carried differently now, slow and reverent, tracing the spaces that had hummed with tension and activity. The wind traced familiar lines through dunes, whispering against walls, moving through wire, and rustling abandoned cloth, carrying a sense of quiet reclamation. Soldiers paused at small markers, a makeshift bench, a dented tin, a note left behind, noticing the delicate interplay of memory and sand. Even the horizon seemed softened, blending dunes and sky in a gentle, unhurried gradient. Tanks and remnants of machinery bore the sheen of dust and time, silent monuments to endurance, softened by the desert's persistent breath. Conversations were muted, whispers or quiet reflections threading across small groups, acknowledging both absence and survival. The fortress, once tense and alert, now held itself gently, its walls resting in the desert's patient embrace. And as the sun lowered, bathing sand and stone in gold, the scene seemed timeless, balanced between what was and what the desert quietly reclaimed. In the empty corners of Tobruk, small signs of life remained, muted and delicate, a journal left open, its pages curling in the dry air, captured thoughts that had once threaded through days of endurance. Trinkets, carefully folded letters, and small mementos lay quietly under layers of dust, the desert softening edges without erasing the traces of human care. Even the faint shimmer of metal on a distant tank or a weathered gate reflected the soft sun, carrying a gentle echo of perseverance. Soldiers walked slowly, touching these traces lightly, feeling a soft connection to the months of vigilance, now dissolved into calm reflection. The wind carried the faintest scent of distant blooms, scattered by desert and time, blending life and memory into a subtle rhythm. Dust continued to drift, collecting in corners over walls and across open spaces, uniting the fortress with dunes beyond. And as the horizon softened in amber and shadow, Tobruk seemed to fold inward, a quiet testament to endurance and the desert's patient reclamation. The buried and unseen became present in thought, a quiet acknowledgement of absence and permanence. Small mounds of sand hinted at what had been, at lives quietly woven into the desert and then absorbed into it. Soldiers paused at these spaces, reflecting softly, their breaths gentle, hands resting lightly, attuned to both memory and emptiness. Even the walls held a sense of calm, stone softened by sun and dust, echoing the patient rhythm of time. Tins and tools, once vital, now rested as soft shapes in sand, their forms absorbed into patterns of light and grain. Conversations carried reverence, a low hum of reflection, connecting men to both past endurance and present stillness. The desert shaped shadows and light into gentle undulations, blurring lines between earth, memory, and structure. And as the sun tilted toward its final arc, the fortress exhaled with the wind, a quiet sigh of surrender to the desert's patient claim. Every path traced through the fortress now seemed to lead, not outward but inward, inviting reflection and observation. Steps stirred faint dust rising in pale plumes that caught light and shadow, ephemeral markers of presence. Wire sagged and curved under months of gentle neglect, folding into the desert's rhythm as if listening to its patient insistence. Objects scattered across floors and dunes held a soft weight, reminders of the human touch slowly absorbed into sand and silence. Soldiers lingered in slow observation, hands brushing walls, feet tracing paths of endurance, eyes noting lines softened by wind and light. Even the distant horizon seemed to pause, stretching gently across dunes in pale amber, quiet and contemplative. Small gestures once hurried, now carried deliberate calm, reflections of presence, endurance, and careful attention. And as dusk crept over the fortress, shadows deepened, melding wall and sand into one fluid expanse, a space suspended between memory and reclamation. The desert's persistent rhythm wove through every space, soft and unrelenting, reshaping both fortress and mind. Men walked slowly among remnants, noting subtle shifts in sand, temperature and wind, absorbing the quiet claim of the landscape. Tanks, medals, and letters now rested under layers of gentle dust, silent witnesses to months of endurance. Conversation fell to whispers or quiet hums, acknowledging the subtle weight of history embedded in walls, wire, and sand. Even the faintest sounds, shifting dust, creaking metal, distant wind, carried meaning, soft markers of ongoing reclamation. Soldiers paused often, touching objects lightly, letting memory linger in the folds of sun and shadow. The horizon held a muted glow, blending sky and dunes into one continuous expanse, soft and enduring. And as night descended, Tobruk rested in a profound calm, a quiet testament to human perseverance and the desert's patient, unhurried turn. By nightfall, the fortress and desert seemed to breathe together, a unified rhythm of stillness and reflection. Stars emerged softly above dunes and walls, casting pale light across tanks, medals, and wire, weaving together memory and reclamation. Soldiers moved gently, noting small patterns, dust shifts, and lingering traces of life, embracing the quiet aftermath with reverence. The wind whispered across the sand, smoothing contours, threading calm through empty trenches, and shaping the scene into gentle fluidity. Even the smallest objects, left behind or partially buried, carried weight, reminders of time, endurance, and care. Conversations muted and measured, traced gentle lines through space, acknowledging both the past and the quiet presence of the present. The desert embraced all, softening edges and weaving history into its patient rhythm. And as the night deepened, Tobruk rested suspended in reflection, dust and shadow, a fortress both reclaimed and eternal in the desert's quiet turn. Years passed, and the desert settled softly over Tobruk, smoothing edges and weaving silence through walls, wire, and dunes alike. Veterans returned quietly, stepping onto familiar sand with measured reverence, tracing paths their younger selves had known so well. The wind carried faint echoes of months long past, whispers of endurance threading through the soft rustle of sand and the occasional call of distant birds. Tanks and fortifications, once vital and imposing, rested gently under layers of dust, their forms softened, integrated into the desert's patient rhythm. Men paused often, hands resting lightly on walls or scattered remnants, feeling the pulse of memory in both the landscape and themselves. The sun cast long muted shadows, painting dunes and trenches in subdued gold and amber, a quiet acknowledgement of time and persistence. Letters, journals, and personal objects were handled with gentle care, tangible fragments of courage and quiet determination. Conversations remained low, reflective, often shared with a pause, letting the desert absorb both words and emotions. And in each breath drawn across the soft sun-warmed sand, the memory of endurance lingered, delicate and persistent, like grains slipping between fingers. The fortress itself seemed to inhale, holding space for reflection, for remembrance, for the weight of quiet triumph. Veterans walked slowly along wire and walls, noting changes brought by time and wind, the desert claiming yet honoring what had been. The dunes shifted softly with each passing breeze, folding trenches and paths into gentle gradients, carrying memory across the horizon in subtle, unhurried waves. Even small objects left behind, a tin, a notebook, a rusted tool, seemed to hum with the faint presence of hands long gone. Reminders of ordinary acts, sustained through extraordinary days. Men paused to observe these traces, brushing dust lightly, feeling the soft connection between past and present. The air held warmth, scented faintly of sand and sun, a quiet embrace of history and endurance. Steps across dunes left temporary marks, patterns soon softened by wind, a meditation on impermanence and continuity. Conversations moved in hushed tones, shared reflection threading through pauses and gestures, carrying stories across silence. And as the afternoon light mellowed, the fortress held itself in a calm balance between memory, reverence, and quiet life. Soft gusts stirred the desert, lifting fine grains that drifted over walls, wire, and scattered artifacts, smoothing edges and blending the human past with timeless sand. Veterans observed patterns in dust, the shifting of dunes and subtle changes in horizon light, recognizing traces of the time when the siege demanded everything. Even small movements, a bent gate or an eroded tank tread, told stories that words alone could not carry. Hands rested lightly on walls, on wire, on the cold metal of abandoned equipment, grounding memory in tangible texture. The horizon glowed in soft, muted amber, stretching endlessly, a quiet witness to both human endurance and the desert's patient reclamation. Words spoken were few, measured, threaded with respect and quiet acknowledgement of both hardship and survival. Footsteps pressed gently into sand, leaving impressions soon erased by wind, a reminder of transient presence within enduring landscape. The desert hummed softly with the rhythm of time, a companion to reflection, memory, and the gentle exhalation of relief. And in that hush, veterans sensed the persistent pulse of the younger selves they once had been, lingering like soft shadows across dunes and walls. Letters, journals, and medals were handled with deliberate calm, each item a tactile bridge across decades, connecting memory with desert and self. Veterans opened pages carefully, reading quietly, absorbing words written in urgency, hope, or reflection, each sentence softening in the desert's warmth. Medals dulled by sand and sun reflected gentle light, reminders of courage preserved not in noise or spectacle, but in sustained human endurance. Tanks and fortifications, partially buried, lent a sense of continuity, silent sentinels marking time's gentle passage. Conversations were deliberate, reflective, punctuated by pauses that let the desert carry meaning in unspoken ways. Dust rose softly with movement, tracing arcs across sand and metal, blending past action with present stillness. Even small gestures, a nod, a breath drawn deeply, a hand resting on a wall, carried weight, subtle markers of reverence. Horizon and dunes merged in soft gradients, creating spaces that were both present and memory-laden, gentle and enduring. And as light softened, veterans stood quietly, letting the desert fold history and endurance into one gentle expanse. The fortress breathed in harmony with the wind. Its walls softened, its wire draped in shadows that stretched and blended with sand. Veterans moved slowly, aware of each step, each grain of dust displaced, as if their presence alone carried both memory and reverence. Small objects left behind, partially buried, seemed to pulse softly with human touch, fragile and enduring all at once. Shadows lengthened, folding tanks, walls, and dunes into muted patterns of remembrance. Conversations threaded lightly through space, a whisper here, a soft reflection there, interlaced with long pauses to let meaning settle. The sun moved low, casting amber light that kissed edges of walls and sand, painting gentle highlights across a landscape both lived in and reclaimed. Men paused to breathe deeply, inhaling history, endurance, and wind in equal measure. Each footstep and gentle touch was meditative, connecting body, mind, and memory with the soft rhythm of desert reclamation. And as evening approached, the fortress held itself still, cradled in sand, sun, and memory, an echo of courage threaded through time. Time seemed to slow as veterans lingered, tracing familiar paths with quiet reverence, absorbing the desert's patient embrace. Even the faintest wind stirred dust in gentle plumes, echoing months of endurance and whispering of years past. Tanks, wire, and fortifications appeared softened, integrated into the landscape, yet still marked by human presence and memory. Small objects, carefully handled, carried the weight of months and years, tangible reminders of courage quietly endured. Conversations continued in hushed tones, stories overlapping reflection, memory, and observation, weaving a tapestry of endurance across silence. Steps pressed gently into sand, leaving impressions that the desert would soon reclaim, a lesson in impermanence held softly in each footprint. Shadows lengthened, blending walls, dunes, and equipment into one harmonious expanse of muted color and soft texture. Veterans paused often, listening to wind, inhaling dust and warmth, feeling the pulse of memory in every touch. And as stars emerged over desert and fortress alike, the quiet of Tobruk carried the resonance of courage across time. The night air settled, cool and gentle, brushing sand and metal, carrying whispers of endurance and memory across dunes. Veterans lingered under starlight, tracing soft paths, touching familiar walls, letting both wind and quiet wrap around history in calm embrace. The desert's persistent rhythms smoothed edges, softened contrasts, and wove the story of human endurance into each grain of sand. Objects, journals, and medals rested under gentle night air, their significance held in the stillness around them. Conversation dwindled to soft hums or quiet reflection, attention drawn outward to horizon and inward to memory. Footsteps moved slowly, carefully, leaving delicate impressions soon erased by wind, a meditation on the ephemeral within the enduring. Shadows traced soft patterns across wire, sand, and stone, blending past and present into one continuous reflection. The wind whispered faintly, threading continuity across years, memories, and landscape alike. And as veterans paused to breathe in the quiet, the fortress, desert, and memory merged, a single echo of endurance resonating softly under stars. By the end of the night, Tobruk held a calm, suspended between history and present, between sand and human memory. Stars shimmered gently, their soft light falling across dunes, wire, tanks, and walls, weaving all into a quiet continuum. Veterans rested in reflection, noting traces of younger selves lingering. Their presence felt softly in every gesture and pause. Dust settled in gentle patterns, carrying both history and soft reclamation, integrating human effort with desert patience. Journals, letters, and small artifacts rested quietly, each one a marker of courage and endurance, threaded across time. The wind traced over sand and stone, shaping soft contours and carrying a gentle hum of remembrance. Conversations were rare, hushed or absent, letting silence hold the space, creating room for memory to breathe. And as night deepened over Tobruk, the fortress and desert embraced the echoes of those who had endured, threading courage and quiet through the eternal rhythm of sand and sky. The sun rose gently over Tobruk, spreading warm light across sandstone and the pale shimmer of the Mediterranean. Bunkers and walls, once tense with vigilance, now rested quietly, softened by time and the desert's patient hand. Locals wandered along paths where trenches had once run, their footsteps stirring fine dust that drifted lazily across walls and rusted metal. The harbor reflected the sun in gentle ripples, calm and steady, carrying a muted echo of supply runs and distant engines long silenced. Wind traced soft patterns across dunes and walls, whispering through gaps in stone, through broken wire, carrying memory and quiet in equal measure. Even the scattered remnants of tanks and tools seemed softened, part of the landscape now, integrated into sand and light. Birds called occasionally, arcs of life, weaving gently over sunlit ruins, a quiet testament to renewal and continuity. And in that subtle rhythm, the desert seemed to exhale, holding history and stillness together in delicate balance. The old bunkers bore witness to silence, their walls marked by sun, sand, and gentle erosion. Each crack and curve a soft trace of endurance. Passers-by brushed against their edges, unaware of the small echoes left by soldiers decades earlier, yet their presence stirred faint whispers across the stone. Dust settled over ledges and crevices, covering fragments of letters, tins, and tools long absorbed into memory. The warm wind lifted fine grains, weaving them across paths and dunes, carrying both the present moment and the weight of months endured into the soft horizon. Even the harbour held quiet testimony, the gentle lapping of waves threading continuity between sand and water, between history and calm. Light shifted slowly, painting walls and dunes in muted amber and gold, accentuating the gentle curves carved by human hands and desert wind alike. Conversations drifted faintly from nearby streets, blending with the soft sigh of wind and distant water, a gentle chorus of life among ruins. And as the afternoon stretched onward, Tobruk seemed to fold history into the present, every grain of sand a soft repository of memory. Walking among walls and wire, visitors noticed traces of the past in subtle ways. A dent here, a shadow there, shapes softened, yet resonant. Tanks and fortifications, rusted and half-buried, rested like gentle reminders of endurance, holding space for both reflection and quiet admiration. The air carried warmth and faint salt, mingling sand, sun, and sea, in an aroma that spoke of persistence and renewal. Small objects, remnants of soldiers' lives, lay softened by years of wind and dust, markers of a time suspended yet present. Children ran along paths once patrolled in tense hours, their laughter threading lightly through ruins, a gentle contrast to history held in stone. The desert itself seemed to breathe in harmony with life, carrying past and present together in soft motion. Birds wheeled above sunlit sand, arcs tracing gentle stories across a sky pale and vast. And as light shifted toward the horizon, the fortress and harbour, dunes and wind, all seemed quietly attuned to a long memory folded softly into the present. The coastline offered gentle reflections of history and calm, waves tracing soft lines across sand and harbour alike. Old piers, worn by sun and water, rested quietly, echoing the rhythm of ships long past, supplying Tobruk during its long vigil. Rusted bollards partially buried held quiet testimony to journeys made in stealth and courage, now softened beneath light and time. Locals passed slowly along paths between dunes and walls, unhurried, their presence tracing new patterns over old, each step carrying history beneath and beneath it, present life, even small items, a tin, a fragment of wood, a rusted hinge, seemed integrated into sand, light, and wind, a delicate tapestry of endurance and reclamation. Conversations drifted on the warm breeze, low and unhurried, blending with rustling leaves and the faint lapping of water. Shadows lengthened folding walls, sand and ruins, into gentle gradients of amber and soft grey, merging past and present. And in that quiet stretch between dunes and sea, Tobruk held itself in stillness, both witness and participant in the desert's patient remembrance. The desert whispered softly across open dunes, threading between ruins, marking every mound, every hollow, with quiet memory. Tanks and fortifications, softened and partially buried, seemed to hold silent vigil, observing new life in the gentle sun. The wind carried grains over medals, journals, and scattered artifacts, smoothing edges, softening contrasts, turning objects into subtle markers of endurance. Men and women walked slowly, touching walls and traces of wire, sensing history without words, feeling the pulse of time beneath their fingers. Birds wheeled low, occasional calls, threading the quiet arcs of life, punctuating soft reflections. Even the harbour, with its calm waves and sunlit piers, seemed part of the memory, holding echoes of sailors and convoys, threading through months of vigilance. Conversations were few, gentle, reflective, weaving together past and present, endurance and calm, in measured tones. And as afternoon light faded into soft amber, the desert held Tobruk and all within it in a timeless embrace, quiet and enduring. Footsteps traced paths once vital, now softened by wind, sun, and decades, carrying both attention and reflection. Small objects emerged through dust in gentle discovery, a fragment of metal, a rusted tool, a weathered notebook, each bearing quiet testament to human presence. Even walls and wire, eroded by sun and wind, retained traces of purpose, of endurance, of human touch, visible only in subtle shadows and textures. Children's laughter and the soft hum of life, threaded between dunes, a delicate contrast to the slow, meditative pulse of history. Waves lapped quietly along the harbour, their rhythm steady, mirroring the subtle rhythm of memory, traced in sand and stone. Shadows deepened, painting gentle gradients across ruins and dunes, merging past vigilance with present calm. Visitors paused often, letting their eyes and hands absorb quiet traces, honoring endurance without disturbance. And in the gentle evening light, Tobruk seemed both present and suspended, a desert memory folded softly into time's patient rhythm. The dunes shifted subtly under evening wind, carrying grains across walls, wire, and open spaces, weaving history into the living landscape. Tanks, bunkers, and fortifications, softened by decades of sun and sand, rested in quiet solidarity, absorbed into the rhythm of desert and time. Locals moved along paths between dunes and ruins, steps deliberate, breaths gentle, acknowledging the presence of endurance, folded into the environment. Small objects left behind, softened by wind and light, traced stories quietly, integrated into the landscape without need of ceremony. Waves whispered along the harbour, a soft accompaniment to wind and memory, threading past and present into continuous calm. Shadows merged across sand, walls, and rusted metal, forming subtle tapestries that held traces of courage and quiet vigilance. Conversations drifted low, reflective, harmonizing with wind, waves, and the pulse of sunlit sand. And as the horizon deepened into muted tones, Tobruk held itself in stillness, a desert that remembered without sound or claim, patient and enduring. Night approached gently, folding dunes, harbour, and ruins into one expansive quiet, softened by fading light. Stars emerged slowly, pale and steady above sand, wire, and walls, weaving gentle constellations over ruins once tense with vigilance. Veterans and visitors alike paused, breathing softly, hands resting lightly on walls, wire, and scattered artifacts, feeling history thread through presence. Dust settled in muted plumes, stirred occasionally by wind, a subtle dance connecting past endurance with the calm of the present. And fortifications rested under gentle starlight, each a quiet repository of courage and memory. Conversations waned, leaving soft hums or silence, letting the desert cradle all within its rhythm. Shadows merged into gentle gradients of sand, wall, and rusted metal, creating a seamless continuum of history, reflection, and calm. And as night deepened fully, Tobruk and the surrounding desert rested together, a landscape alive with memory, patience, and quiet endurance. The desert stretched endlessly under a pale morning sun, sand and stone softening in warm light, as if the land itself had exhaled after years of vigilance. Winds drifted gently across dunes, stirring grains that carried stories older than memory, weaving whispers of endurance across walls, wire, and rusted metal. The sea beyond shimmered with quiet persistence, tides tracing gentle arcs along the harbour, a rhythm as steady as time itself. Even the bunkers, weathered and worn, held their silence with grace, resting in the calm that followed long months of tension and watchfulness. Occasional footsteps of a passing visitor shifted dust softly, a human presence threading delicately through layers of memory. Shadows stretched across walls and sand, muted and long, folding the past into the present in a continuous, patient embrace. The wind lifted the faint scent of salt, dust, and sun-warmed stone, carrying with it the quiet pulse of history. And in that soft, enduring expanse, every trace of the siege seemed suspended, preserved not in noise, but in patient silence that held everything. Grains of sand glinted faintly in sunlight, each one a tiny repository of memory, reflecting moments of endurance, fear, and quiet triumph. The distant hum of waves merged with the whisper of wind, a gentle duet across land and sea, bridging time and presence. Walls and wire, partially softened by decades of erosion, marked the contours of a fortress now empty, yet alive with invisible echoes. Objects left behind, tools, tins, fragments of journals, lay scattered, their meaning magnified by the hush that surrounded them. Locals moved along paths between dunes, unconsciously tracing the edges of history, their steps soft and reverent. Light shifted slowly, casting subtle gradients across sand, stone, and sea, a muted symphony of form and memory. Birds called quietly overhead, arcs of life tracing patterns across the pale sky, a gentle counterpoint to enduring stillness below. And as the afternoon sun descended, the desert seemed to inhale deeply, holding past and present in its timeless rhythm. Time itself felt suspended, the desert absorbing days, decades, and stories with effortless patience. A landscape both living and remembering. Rusted remnants of tanks and fortifications rested quietly, half buried, softened by wind, sun, and time, their presence speaking of resilience and quiet determination. The harbour reflected muted sunlight, small waves whispering across piers that had once carried convoys through the long siege. Every shadow, every ridge of sand seemed to hold subtle traces of those who endured. The human pulse folded softly into earth and stone. A faint breeze shifted dust across letters and journals, smoothing edges and weaving fragments of courage into the larger tapestry of memory. Even distant footsteps echoed lightly, absorbed immediately into the expanse of sand, a reminder of human transience against enduring land. Conversations drifted on soft wind, low and reflective, intertwining observation, remembrance, and quiet wonder. And in that gentle continuity, the desert held Tobruk and all its history in a seamless, enduring hush. The sun lowered further, bathing walls and dunes in amber and soft gold, casting long, quiet shadows that folded past into present. Every ridge and hollow of the desert seemed to breathe, a slow rhythm marking endurance without noise, without claim. Small objects, a tin, a journal fragment, a bent piece of wire, glimmered faintly, witnesses to ordinary acts of courage now sanctified by time. Waves lapped steadily, each crest and fall threading a subtle cadence across harbour and land alike, a rhythm of continuity. The dunes shifted softly under a gentle wind, moulding themselves over old trenches and tracks, integrating human presence into timeless patterns. Birds traced arcs across the sky, their paths both lively and fleeting, delicate punctuation marks in the quiet of history. Even walls and fortifications, softened by sun and sand, seemed to hum with latent memory, absorbed into the patient pulse of the desert. And as light waned toward evening, the silence deepened, holding everything, past, present, sand and sea, in gentle equilibrium. Shadows lengthened into muted purple and gold, folding rusted metal, stone and dunes into one continuous gradient, a soft meditation of memory and time. Visitors walked slowly among ruins, touching walls or tracing edges of wire, their movements respectful, aware of endurance threaded into every grain of sand. The faint sound of the harbor blended with wind through dunes, carrying quiet continuity between present life and lingering echoes of human perseverance. Objects once vital now lay softened by dust, their significance amplified by the surrounding hush, reminders of courage quietly preserved. Each subtle shift of sunlight revealed textures of stone, metal, and sand, a gentle choreography written by light and patience. Steps moved lightly over dunes, impressions fleeting, absorbed almost immediately by wind and time. Lessons in impermanence within endurance. Conversations waned to soft hums or silent reflection, letting the desert hold both memory and witness with equanimity. And as the horizon softened into twilight, Tobruk rested in itself, a desert memory folded tenderly into earth, wind, and quiet sky. Night approached slowly, cool and gentle. The desert breathing softly under fading amber light and lengthening shadows. Stars emerged, pale and steady, their quiet constellations mirroring the rhythm of sand, sea, and stone below. Tanks, bunkers, and scattered objects rested undisturbed, integrated into the land, each one a marker of quiet endurance threaded across time. The wind traced over dunes, wire, and walls, carrying soft echoes of those who had endured months of siege, whispers nearly imperceptible yet persistent. Locals walked slowly along familiar paths, footsteps soft, blending present life into the desert's patient record. The harbor mirrored starlight, water shifting gently with calm and continuity, a steady heartbeat across land and memory. Shadows and light formed subtle gradients across dunes and ruins, connecting past vigilance to present tranquility. And as night deepened, the desert seemed to fold itself around all within it, a soft, enduring cradle of memory and quiet persistence. Evening deepened further, and the horizon blended sea, sand, and sky into muted tones, a seamless continuum of quiet. The ruins held their stillness, walls and wire softened by time, and the presence of human courage persisted in subtle patterns across sand and stone. Small objects glimmered faintly in starlight, each one a quiet echo of endurance, quietly integrated into the landscape. Waves whispered along the harbor, a gentle accompaniment to wind through dunes, a timeless dialogue between land, sea, and memory. Footsteps traced paths long traveled, impressions fleeting yet recorded softly in attention and thought. Shadows merged into one harmonious sweep of muted color, unifying past, present, and landscape in calm continuity. Conversations were absent or hushed, letting silence hold space for reflection, reverence, and meditation. And as the night deepened fully, the desert, ruins, and sea held history in quiet balance, a patient witness to endurance threaded across time. The night sky settled above dunes, harbor, and ruins, pale stars shimmering in quiet acknowledgement of the past. Wind drifted softly, stirring grains over walls, wire, and scattered remnants of human presence, carrying memory gently across the desert. Tanks, fortifications, and artifacts rested quietly, their forms softened by years and time, integrated fully into the landscape. Even the faintest movement of visitors was absorbed instantly by sand and wind, a meditation on transience and lasting memory. The desert's rhythm persisted, slow, patient, endless, holding history in its quiet pulse, embracing both what had been endured and what persisted. Shadows and moonlight traced gentle patterns across sand and stone, folding courage and reflection into one continuous flow. Conversations had vanished entirely, leaving the desert sea and ruins to hold their patient witness alone. And beneath the quiet sky, the desert remembered, not the battle, but the breath that refused to fade.